Good afternoon and welcome to the District of Squamish Committee of the Whole meeting for Tuesday, December the 18th, 2020. My name is John French and I am the acting mayor for the month of December, so I will be chairing this afternoon's meeting. And welcome to the traditional territory of the Squamish people. And I'll entertain a motion to adopt an amended agenda, amended to include a closed meeting session at the end of this meeting. That's moved by Councillor Race and seconded by Councillor Herford. I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries, unanimous. And yes, Councillor Race.
Sorry, just on that point, I'm not sure that we have links for a closed session, so just maybe alert staff so we can have one emailed to us in time. I don't think I have.
Good. Okay, staff has heard that request. Thank you, Councillor Race. And Ministerial Order M192, the staff recommendation is that pursuant to Ministerial Order number M192, the District of Squamish is excluding in-person public attendance at this December 8, 2020 meeting on the basis that full public attendance in a manner consistent with public health orders and recommendations cannot be accommodated at this time. And the district is ensuring openness, transparency, accessibility, and accountability at this meeting by the following means. The meeting is being live streamed, and a video of this meeting will be available on the district's website for viewing on an on-demand basis. And do I have a mover for that motion? Mayor Elliott, seconded by Councillor Herford. I'll call the question. All those in favor? And are there any opposed? None. Motion carries unanimous. And just a quick note that I need to read. Council members attending the meeting electronically are required to advise the chair of the meeting of the following circumstances. A, when the council member disconnects and or reconnects, enters or exits the meeting, so that this can be recorded in the minutes of the meeting. B, council members are to identify themselves when they advise the chair that they wish to be placed on the speakers list. With respect to a vote, council members are only required to state a nay vote. No statement is required if the member is in favor. D, council members shall put the telephone or computer on mute unless they wish to speak. E, council members shall be involved in and participate in the meeting. F, council members shall text the chief administrative officer or the corporate officer if they have technical difficulty with their telephone or computer and they need to be reconnected to the meeting. G, the meeting shall be recessed for up to 10 minutes if a technical difficulty occurs on the district side, which results in the council member being unable to be connected to the meeting. And with that, we'll move to number 4, staff reports. And item number 1 there is the introduction of official community plan amendment to extend the growth management boundary and redesignate District Lot 509 and 510 to residential neighborhoods. And I believe I'm turning this over to Mr. Velaniskas.
That's right. Thank you, Chair. Just trying to share my screen. Can everybody see the screen, the presentation?
It's not in presentation mode, but we can see your screen, yeah.
Okay. How about now?
Yes, there we go. Thank you.
Perfect. So good afternoon, Council and Committee. My name is Jonas Velaniskas. I'm with the Community Planning Department. And today I'm introducing an application to amend the District of Squamish official community plan for District Lots 509 and 510. These lands are also known as the Chima lands. And so for context, District Lots 509 and 510 are together produce a large parcel of approximately 170 hectares in size, located just north of the Garibaldi Highlands neighborhood. The area contains a variety of terrain, including flat areas along the southern and western property boundaries, and more mountainous terrain at the center and in the northern sections of the property. Portions of the lands closer to the northern end sit at or above the 200-meter elevation, which is an important elevation mark in our official community plan when it comes to growth management. Lands contain high recreation values for Squamish residents and beyond. From a land use perspective, the land use designation right now for these lands in our OCP is future residential neighborhoods and currently located outside of the growth management boundary. And below you'll see here is the definition from our official community plan for future residential neighborhoods. These are essentially areas that have been set aside to accommodate longer-term growth through neighborhood planning. So they are set aside to allow for infill opportunities to materialize within our existing neighborhoods, areas that are within the growth management boundary, before we grow into these peripheral areas. Some background on this application. So there was an application back in 2017 that was submitted under the old official community plan. It was to amend the old official community plan to remove the threshold, the population threshold that was placed on that property of 22,500. And that would have allowed proceeding with a neighborhood planning process. In 2018, the district adopted a new official community plan, which is the current one, Squamish 2040. And so the applicant had changed the application to essentially be identical to what is being applied for in 2020, which was to change the designation from future residential neighborhoods to residential neighborhoods, and then amend the growth management boundary to include it. In 2018, the decision was made on that application, and it failed. It failed to meet three key policy areas. So it was one, to ensure that infill is realized within the growth management boundary in the short term. And the short term under our current OCP is somewhere between 2022 and 2023. It's based on a 5-year period, with our OCP being drafted in 2017 and then adopted in 2018. It failed to meet the minimum population threshold back then. It was, and it still is, 22,500 to be achieved before we can consider expansions. And it failed to meet the requirement for a suite of policies to be completed that would guide development in the district. And so that policy was really there to make sure that we've got all of our ducks in a row before we consider these big decisions for growth management. So in 2020, the same application was made as 2017. And so there's two amendments proposed. One is to expand the growth management boundary as contained in Schedule C of the OCP. And you can see it here. On the left is the current boundary, and on the right would be the proposed boundary, fully taking in the lands. The second amendment is to change the land use designation for District Lot 509 and 510 to residential neighborhood, which would essentially, together with the growth management boundary expansion, would allow for the neighborhood planning process to begin. So in terms of policy review to date on this application, the policies that have been considered are the specific growth management policies. Because the application is specific to just the growth management policy, we have not looked at the broader range of OCP policies or other district policies in this application at this point. That would be done in future applications, because the principal question is there sufficient level of alignment with the OCP growth management policies to just initiate a comprehensive review process and community consultation for this proposed expansion? Assuming that a high level of compliance would be necessary once the bylaw is presented for advanced readings by council. So full compliance at this time may not be critical to initiate the review process. It will be necessary, as I said, later on in this application review stage. If council deems that there is sufficient level of compliance at this time to initiate the review, staff will go away, secure the necessary resources that will be required to process the application in a comprehensive manner, prepare a detailed roadmap for the application process before coming back to council for sign off on the next steps. Council could also decide that the level of information presented here is enough in case council deems that there isn't, the level of compliance is not sufficient to initiate the comprehensive review process. So that's the difference in two motions that I will discuss later on. So here we've got from the report a summary of the policies in the OCP that have been reviewed against for this application. So I'm just going to try and quickly go through these and discuss the level of compliance. So the first policy is to direct all residential and associated commercial and industrial institutional development to occur within the growth management boundary. Obviously, the growth management boundary currently excludes District Lot 509 and 510, and so compliance with this policy is low. However, it is subject to policy 9.2F, which does allow for that population threshold of 22,500 to be the indicator of when it is appropriate to consider changes. 9.2B directs the majority of residential development to downtown, oceanfront, waterfront landing, and other areas within the growth management boundary where growth is occurring. Substantial completion in these areas of infill opportunities has not yet occurred. However, as outlined in the report, the growth is well underway, particularly in the downtown area. And we've had quite a few housing units being in construction or having had an occupancy permit in the last 5 years. So really compliance with this policy, because it says direct majority of growth into these areas, will depend on the amount of units, housing units being proposed on District Lots 509 and 510, and the timing of those units to make sure that it does not go out of pace with our infill development. And these, this policy would have to be further examined through the comprehensive review process. The third policy is C, which directs future residential neighborhoods being long-term growth areas, not required to meet housing needs within the next 5 years. So that's the 2023 mark. And nor intended to accommodate major growth until substantial completion of residential infill has occurred. Again, this process would be followed by a comprehensive neighborhood planning process, which would then be followed by a rezoning process, development permitting, building permitting, and the process, for neighborhood planning and for deciding whether the growth management boundary should be extended is going to be, I think, not a quick process by design. So it is quite unlikely that we would see any development prior to 2024. On policy D, substantial completion on infill within the growth management boundary achieved once population reaches 34,000, or construction has been completed for 75% of development potential. So this is a policy that may not be directly applicable to this application. It establishes the parameters of how the district can decide whether these opportunities for infill have been realized. So it's either population of 34,000 or infill opportunities being realized up to 75%. Compliance with this policy is low because obviously we're not at 34,000, and there's still quite a bit of infill opportunities in Squamish. However, it is subject to the policy 9.2F in that 9.2F takes the 34,000 population threshold and brings it down to 22,500 in certain cases. And now we get to 9.2F, which states that despite some of these other policies we just mentioned, the district can consider development in future residential neighborhoods once we are at 22,500, as identified by provincial population estimate or most recent federal census, provided that the impacts identified in policies such as socioeconomic, environmental, recreational values have been considered, and all precursor policies in 9.2H have been adopted. So there's two criteria for 9.2F, which is, well, actually three. There's the population threshold, there are the consideration of impacts of this expansion, and there's the suite of policies that need to be adopted. So in our assessment, the population numbers are what's really interesting in Squamish, especially for the last 4 years that have been published. There's substantial difference between the federal and provincial estimates, especially when we contrast it with the new housing units being added in Squamish over the last 5 years. So I've got a table here at the bottom of the slide, and it shows that according to federal population estimates, Squamish was at 22,397 in 2019. So just 100 people short, essentially, of that 22,500 threshold. The average growth rate during that period between 2015 and 2019, according to the federal estimates, is 2.6% annually. And so if we look back between 2010 and 2015, the average rate was 2.8. So there was a bit of a slowdown in population growth in the last 4 years up to 2019 than it was in previous years. But then when we look at provincial data, the population of Squamish has been shrinking since 2017, with a considerable drop between 2018 and 2019. So according to provincial stats, our average growth rate between 2010 and 2015 was 2.9%, which is pretty close to the federal 2.8%. It was one of the highest in the province. But between 2015 and 2019, it was only 0.8%, one of the lower rates in the province. And that does not correspond with the federal estimates. So we've also looked at another parameter that the province publishes, which is the community health service areas. And the boundary for community health service areas, the geographical boundary, is very closely aligned with Squamish's boundary for population. Both of these are provincial stats. Both of these capture the same kind of areas that contain housing units in Squamish, but the provincial one for population has 20,819. The provincial one for community health service areas has 22,926 in 2019. So there's quite a difference between these two provincial stats. And so we reached out to the province and we asked them what was the rationale between such a big difference between the two numbers. And the response we got was that the community health service area population estimate is brand new for 2019. They've just started doing it. And that the estimate for population for Squamish there were some changes in the way the province was making these estimates, and essentially they got this number from the federal from Stats Canada, and so in essence, both of these numbers, according to the province, are likely incorrect, and that the actual number is somewhere in between, but those corrections have not been done yet. So at this point, what staff have been using in other projects is the federal population estimate that seems to be much more closely aligned with the housing occupancy numbers that we are seeing in terms of occupancy permits being issued and just the projects that are on the ground being built in the last 5 years. So based on that, it is quite likely that in 2020, we are already at 22,500. And now over to policy 9.2G, which directs that when evaluating future residential neighborhood amendments, consider whether there are negative environmental, social, or economic impacts that cannot be adequately mitigated or offset. So this would have to be subject to a comprehensive review process. It would involve assessment of infrastructure, in general terms, infrastructure, operational costs and maintenance, assessment of environmentally sensitive areas, wildlife corridors, socioeconomic and health impacts, traffic impacts, and options, and of course, recreational values, which are key on this property as well. So compliance with this policy is yet to be determined through this comprehensive review process. 9.2H is the policy that contains the policy precursors. And so we've got a list on the slide here, brand asset inventory, that is something that is underway. As it relates to this property, this is something that SORCA is doing with their front country mapping inventory. The community amenity contribution policy has been completed. The perpetually affordable housing policy has been completed. Missing middle housing policy and regulations are underway, and these are contained in the phase 2 of our zoning bylaw update. So this is in relation to allowance for duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes. Updated wildfire protection plan is complete, and the only policy that we are not working on that is not complete at this point is the steep slopes development permit area. This is projected to as a project in 2021 pending budget assignment. And so the applicant has offered to fund this this policy development process as part of their application. So compliance in this policy area is medium to high. Work is either underway or completed, with the exception of the steep slopes development permit area guidelines. Finally, there is another policy, 9.2J, which directs that consideration of major changes to the growth management boundary should be only done as the outcome of either, and then it gives a number of options. One that is applicable to this application would be a comprehensive public engagement process that clearly identifies the rationale, benefits, and consequences of proposed change and involves meaningful community review to ensure the public concerns and aspirations are consistently understood and addressed. So this would be something that we would have to work through the comprehensive review process. The application there has been some public engagement on this application. I think that this policy directs that conversation to be a lot about growth management and what it means to extend the growth management boundary, rather than this, particular benefits of a proposed development plan that may be associated in the future with this proposal. So here we go. Here we've got a summary. I've tried to even shorten it even more than what we've had in the report and the previous slides of the OCP policies. Highlighted in green are the policies that are most applicable to this application. And as you can see, there is, policies are either have to be confirmed through a comprehensive review process, or compliance is medium to high in those areas. And again, the question is whether there's enough compliance to initiate the comprehensive review process. So there's 2 staff recommendations essentially, or options for council to consider. This is a big decision for the future of growth management. The first motion that council directs staff to bring forward the bylaws for consideration really means that council deems that the level of compliance with growth management policies at this stage is too low to start a comprehensive review process. On the other hand, if council does deem that there's enough compliance, the level of compliance is sufficient enough to initiate what will be by design a fairly slow process, that committee provide feedback on the review to date, and that council directs staff to develop a comprehensive application review process and come back before endorsement prior to its implementation. So that really would kick off the bigger project of staff securing resources necessary to process the application, designing a plan, and coming back to council for approval before starting off. And this is just a process that, this is the sequence of applications that would likely play out. So first, we have the current application to expand the growth management boundary and redesignate. There's going to be a ton of work needed to be done on studies that will be required, comprehensive public engagement process. Once that's done, the proponent would be able to move and apply for a neighborhood planning process. And after that, a rezoning, then subdivision, then development permits, and then building permits. And that's it for my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Valeniskis. Council, do you have any questions? Councillor Race.
Interesting. This is the first test of the growth management boundary from the OCP discussions we had last term. So first of all, my first question actually is in the report on the first page, in the first line actually, to introduce an official community plan amendment application for the Lot 1 portion of District Lots 509 and 510. Are we only talking about a portion of the 400 odd acres, or is this intended to be the whole thing?
Through you, Chair, it's intended to be the whole thing. That is just part of the legal description of those two lots because they've been amalgamated into one lot. So I think legally it's defined as Lot 1 portion of. Okay.
So we're talking about a change then for 400 odd acres. And so my questions really are around kind of the decision-making focus. And I frankly, after going through the discussions last term, I didn't kind of expect it to come to us quite in this way. Not that it's wrong, but it's just not what I expected. So the decision, and let me go back and try and put it in context. And sorry if I'm taking up a lot of time, Council, but last term we had these discussions in the growth management about the growth management boundary. And we came to the point during those discussions where we wanted to not have a hard line, but a pretty firm line, I think, and this is my perspective, and left the door ajar for the potential for an application. And we used words like if there was something with a significant community benefit. And once again, this is my recollection. Those words don't actually appear in the policies. But we kicked around things like, what if a Quest University type proposal came to us? We wanted the flexibility to be able to consider that. So the 22.5 was a hard line, pretty hard line. The precursor policies we wanted to be in place because we needed those to properly evaluate the future development that might come to us. And then the question was this significant community benefit. And we don't see it here. But as I go through these policies, the door opening part is, I think, what we're dealing with here. And so that's the 9.2F policy. Despite sections 9.2A and 9.2C, it doesn't say despite 9.2B, which says direct the majority of residential development to these various areas. So that still has to be there. It still would have to comply with that. And staff has stated that that's medium growth occurring rapidly in some areas. And it lists various areas that are more or less considered, but it doesn't, for example, talk about the lands we just dealt with in the recent zoning amendments, those two large single family zone parcels, one at the Crumpet Woods Valley Cliff area, and the other one was more or less, I think it was Newport, ridge area, more or less the bottom of PIA. And so when we consider, part of the decision, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that we have to consider whether this aligns with 9.2B. And when we do consider that, we have to consider then, we have to include things like those other two large parcels, plus all the other infill areas that we're talking about, and decide whether doing this would be compliant with that. In other words, directing majority of residential development to certain areas. So am I correct in saying that? Is that more or less the staff view of this?
Through you, Chair, yes, that's exactly it. I think the key word is majority of residential development.
Right.
And so if we do go down the road of comprehensive review, I think we're going to have to weigh what's happening now in terms of, what's happened over the last 5 years, what areas that are likely to develop in the next 5 to 10 years, and make sure that, whatever happens, if the expansion does happen, is not going to consume majority of our residential growth. So that I think that's where the phasing will be important to determine for this development and set at this at the comprehensive review stage to make sure that that it's not going to become this big source of growth in the medium term.
So if I might, Chair, one more question, then I'll step aside. I've got other thoughts, but and so if we said, yes, it aligns with these policies today, then the next step is a comprehensive review. Is there no more or less the start of a zoning application or OCP change in zoning application? Or is there another intermediate step? And what I'm thinking about is, again, to the discussions we had last term and my recollection of them, we talked about when we might consider the substantial community benefit concept. And my recollection is that, no, it would be kind of a preliminary application as well to decide whether or not a developer should go through the zoning OCP amendment process, which is a huge process in a parcel like this. And you don't want to carry them all the way through that and say, sorry, no community benefit, and just boot it at that time. So it was kind of a preliminary threshold, as I recall it. And would that be the next step if we said, yes, it's a go today?
Through you, Chair, I think we're far away from the zoning discussions at this point. We are at, I think the community benefit language was initially there in the OCP, and then it got replaced fairly quickly after we adopted the OCP, and it was replaced with evaluation of socioeconomic and health benefits or impacts in the OCP. So that would be policy 9.2G. I think that we would be, through the comprehensive review process, we would be evaluating, what are the recreational, the social, the economic impacts of expanding the growth management boundary, and looking at it from that perspective, but not entertaining zoning or even development plans at this stage, but securing certain commitments. So for one, we know that.
Is there someone not muted? I'm getting a lot of background noise.
Well, just me, I'm not muted, but there's nobody else here, so.
Is that me?
Yeah, it could be you, Mr. Valeniscus. It seems to be improved. Carry on, please.
Okay. So I think we would be looking, if the application is successful at this stage, we would be looking to secure certain amenities associated with the application. But we wouldn't be going down to the zoning level discussions.
Okay, I'll step aside. Thanks, Chair, and come back to me later.
Yes, very good. Thank you. I have Councillor Herford next, followed by Councillor Pettingill.
Thank you. In policy 9.2D, it speaks to the percentage of development to have occurred inside the boundary or infill, and there was a specific percentage of 75%. And I was curious, do we know, I mean, I suppose further investigation is what we're considering, but do we have a rough idea of percentage-wise? It's the first time I've seen a percentage in a policy, so it made me think that it was something we were specifically tracking, and if we have an idea of what that percentage is today.
Through you, Chair. That's a really good question. We don't know where we stand at this point in terms of infill opportunities. You're right, it would have to be part of this next step of comprehensive review to look at, you know, we kind of know what our maximum is in terms of infill opportunities, but that could be the timing of those, of filling those in, you know, could be, it could be vastly different depending on development pressures and decisions in neighborhood planning. So I think that needs a fresher look. At this point, I don't know where we are at with that, with regard to that 75%.
Okay, thank you. There was a mention of wildlife corridors, and it seems to be is there a specific policy that that speaks to that? I didn't see it on the list of policy work, but it is mentioned in there as a consideration, and I was just curious if that was an oversight or if that's captured somewhere else.
That was just my interpretation of policy 9.2G, which talks about negative environmental impacts. And so I've included wildlife corridors as a likely consideration as part of that as well.
Okay. Okay, I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Herford. Next, I have Councillor Pettingill, followed by Mayor Elliott.
Thank you. So first, just want to clarify the 22,500 threshold for contemplating a growth management boundary change early is not specific to this property. It's sort of just generally whether or not we should start entertaining possible applications. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. I have it in my head for some reason that the goal is to review the OCP every 5 years, that we haven't typically done it quite every 5, even if that's been our target. And I don't know if that's a provincial wish or best practice or whatever, but can you speak to how often we would normally do or want to do an OCP review?
That's a great question. I think it's a requirement in some provinces to do a review of OCP every 5 years, not in BC. I think it's a good practice to try and do it every 5 years, and especially if you have not, you know, if you're going through a faster growth period, policies need to be adjusted more frequently to respond to growth. In this case, I think our OCP is quite current still, even though it's been well, almost 3 years since we adopted it. So to answer your question, it's a good practice, but it's not a requirement.
Okay, and so then that would mean theoretically, if we're sticking with that practice, we're 2 years away maybe from you know, a thorough review that might address and look at some of these same questions and have some of the discussion with the community.
Yes, I think because we haven't had much talk yet about the next OCP amendment or update, I think we're probably at least 2 years away. Okay.
And then I have a bunch, but the last one I'll ask for now is following from Councillor Race's question about 9.2B, the single family lots that we rezoned as part of our priority rezoning, they are outside of the areas identified in 9.2B, I believe. So as I understand it, there is a fair bit of infill, quite a lot of infill potential there, but they're outside of the area. So they would sort of, I guess, offset doing the majority of development in those priority areas and represent still within the growth management boundary, but a lot of development outside. And so we, from a ratio perspective, we need a lot more development in those priority areas to have the majority still happening there. Is that a fair assessment?
For you, Chair, yes, I think that's a really good point. The policy 9.2B does not call out those areas, although it says direct majority of residential development within the growth management boundary, which those areas would be. But then it goes on to call out specific areas where we have established neighborhoods, so these wouldn't fall in that category.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Pettingill. Mayor Elliott, followed by Councillor Stoner.
So I agree with Councillor Race that the last council worked on this section of the OCP very carefully and the wording very carefully. So, Mr. Villaniskis, is it 2023?
Can you clarify the question?
It said we don't believe that these areas are needed for the next 5 years, which would take us to 2023. So is it 2023?
Yes, for you, Chair, the short term in the OCP, I believe, is the period 2022 to 2023. So we could say it's 2023. And as I think,
but it's 2020 right now.
It's 2020 right now. That's correct.
And are all the precursor policies adopted?
No, as I pointed out in the presentation, we still have one policy that we have not started work on.
But 9.2F says have been adopted.
That's correct. And I think, so what I said was that if council decides that there is sufficient level of compliance to initiate the process, we wouldn't be coming back to a point of, I think, second reading until all of that is satisfied.
One of the things you mentioned was that the wildfire protection DPA is complete, but council hasn't seen that.
Sorry, the policy referred to an updated wildfire protection plan, which that's a different plan. So that it's a plan that we had at that time, and we were when the OCP was adopted, but it was going through an update process, and so it was included as a requirement to update that wildfire protection plan. We are now, as a result of the adoption of that plan, we are doing the wildfire DPA, but it's not a requirement in the policy in the OCP.
It's listed as Squamish Community Wildfire Protection Plan updated and a wildfire protection DPA. Is it not?
Let me just look at my policies.
The wildfire protection plan advises a DPA, which isn't done yet.
Yes, but I don't think it's specific. So that is something we're working on. But I think the OCP policy section 9.2H, updated community wildfire protection plan, defining wildfire risk areas, identifying measures necessary to mitigate risks, and outlining a plan of action and proposed cost to implement the measures. So yes, one of the things that came out of the wildfire protection plan update was that we need a DPA.
So it's important to know, is it not, what those setbacks are, what the requirements are, and the same for steep slopes, because the steep slopes regulation would necessarily dictate how much land is available for development, which would then help us consider the potential economic or servicing impacts. Like these things all sort of roll into each other and all connected. And I think that's why the word was adopted, not before we would entertain this, so that there's a base for the community to discuss what belongs there versus trying to have that conversation with some of the pieces still moving.
Yes, and for you, Chair, I think the key point at this point is the growth management is making a decision of growth management boundary somewhat independent of what the sub-area planning or the neighborhood planning process will look like from here on, because we don't want to. I would caution against prejudging what the development plans will be, because by the time we get to the neighborhood planning process, we'll probably have more policies that will guide development, and they might guide it in a different way. But I think you are right. We need to be in a position to make those decisions when we get to the neighborhood planning process.
That's all I have for now, Chair.
Okay, great, thank you. Councillor Stoner.
Thank you. Through the chair, Mr. Villaniscus, I realize that the numbers in terms of growth are a little bit murky, but in the preamble to the growth management boundary section in the OCP, it states that under lower moderate growth scenarios, additional residential capacity will not be required. Are we certain that we're on track to follow that high growth scenario at this point?
For you, Chair, are we certain? No, we don't know. I'm really curious to see what the census information that hopefully comes out next year will have in terms of population estimates for Squamish, just because I think that in 2019 and 2020, there have been a lot of new occupancies in Squamish. And if those units get filled, it could mean a significant bump up in population for Squamish just based on the last 2 years, as well as 2021, because we do have a lot of units in construction right now. But I think the population projections is a bit of a dark magic. If we look at the history, if we look at the OCP, the projections we had in the OCP when we're doing the 2017 OCP, if we compare them to, provincial estimates, they're not really accurate. So unfortunately, population projections are not very accurate.
Yeah, that's fair. But I guess I just want to clarify that there is potential that we might not actually need any of the future residential neighborhood areas unless we're at that high population growth rate.
Absolutely. I think that we have enough infill opportunities for the medium term, for sure, in Squamish.
Okay, that's it for now. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, very good. And before I put myself on the list, I'll just check in with Councillor Anderson. Do you have any questions? Okay, very good. My first question, the report indicates development could begin within the next 4 years. And I want to get a sense of how likely that timeline is, because that seems rather ambitious to me. Is that an optimistic or maybe through the eyes of a developer, a best case timeline?
That's a really good point. Yes, I think it's the best case scenario. And we know that these processes, especially for neighborhood planning, take multiple years often. So 2024 would be the earliest if council decided that we're going to look at comprehensive review process, and then that was successful, and then the neighborhood planning process ensued, which was also successful. We are, at least 4 years away.
Okay, thank you. And I wonder if you would give us more detail on the costs a developer in a scenario like this would pick up. What would the developer what would the developer pay for in the future in the way of studies, whatever work needs to be done if the growth management boundary is changed?
So in terms of cost, I'm not sure the total cost that will be required for the applicant to cover the cost of these studies. What we will be looking for to initiate the process is recovery costs for our staff time. So we would be probably looking to assign the project to one of our more senior planners to kind of facilitate and guide the process and make sure that the proper steps are being taken, and then backfill that position through the funds secured from the developer.
Very good. Thank you. Councillor Race, I think you indicated you had more questions. Shall I come back around to you? Okay, Councillor Herford.
Thank you. In your presentation, you mentioned the that the 200-meter elevation was of some importance. Could you elaborate on that for us, please?
Yeah, so for you, Chair, there is policy in the official community plan that talks about infrastructure not being extended past the 200-meter elevation point, because it gets costly after that point to maintain it.
Thank you. Councillor Pettingill, followed by Councillor Race.
Yeah, thank you. Just with the funding of the Deep Slopes DPA, I thought I had heard that this policy was relevant to developments that are looking to go ahead within the growth management boundary. Possibly, I vaguely recall that it even came up in some of the priority rezonings we did. I may be mistaken, but I just want to, I guess, is this proposal the only one that might theoretically fund this, or is there other developments or developers that might have an interest in funding that policy if it accelerates their own development?
Through you, Chair, this application is the first one that triggers the requirement for us to have a steep slope DPA in place. Other developments within the growth management boundary, it's either a rezoning process, in which case we can look at the slopes for that area and make decisions based on best practices. What we also have our subdivision development control bylaw that is now been updated to include a lot of the kind of hazard mitigating regulations when it comes to steep slope areas. So this application is the first one that would have to ensure that we've got one before proceeding.
Anything further, Councillor?
I guess so. If is that a function of this is requiring an OCP amendment, and that's why it's only relevant here, or if someone wants a rezoning and they're on steep slopes within their growth management boundary, they don't need this policy isn't relevant, or?
Yes, this policy is not a requirement. So when we look at rezonings, we have to look at compliance with the OCP, and it's only for growth management boundary expansions that the OCP requires that this policy be completed.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Race, followed by Mayor Elliott, and then Councillor Stoner.
Thank you. So, Mr. Velnicius, if this went ahead and we directed staff to go with the comprehensive application review process, I'm still a little bit concerned about where this benefit comes in, because when I look at some of these other things, the points in 9.2G, for example, I look at those as all negatives. So we'd want to make sure there weren't a bunch of negatives. That makes sense. But so 9.2 F is to me is sort of the door ajar provision from these policies, where notwithstanding the boundary, there's a way through if everything falls into place. But it talks about, this public, it's the outcome of public engagement. And so what is the public doing, or what would they be doing in this process? Because unless the deal is on the table, the public is in effect going to invent a deal. So, I mean, nature abhors a vacuum. And so I still go back to this idea of, at some early point, we as a council, I think, would have to consider what the significant community benefit might be, for lack of a better term. I recognize it's not in legislation, before even putting it out to the public. Because otherwise, the public will come back with something and might not be sort of aligned with where council might be even. So early on, it seems that is the deal that would have to go out to the public and say yes or no. What's your engagement? Is that a benefit? Is that a good enough benefit? Recognize the impacts, etc. And so I'm kind of concerned about how that actually might unfold if this went ahead today.
Mm-hmm. Through you, Chair. So I think so that would be the next step, is design a roadmap for the review of this application. And if council, then we would be coming back to council to confirm that before it gets enrolled. If council decided that knowing the minimum amount of amenities proposed with this development is important before we go out to the public, then we would do that with the applicant. And I fully expect that, although we're not going to be dealing with development plans in this process, I think the district will be looking for a minimum threshold that will get secured and enshrined in a covenant through this process that will then inform future applications. But I think this does not preclude future discussions with council about the social, economic, health impact and benefits, or ways to offset it before we go out to the public.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Mayor Elliott.
Thank you. So one of the reasons that we put the growth management boundary in place was actually to level the playing field. So there wasn't just one property sitting outside of it, but that we made a decision that, you know, where it needed to go, where development should happen in the short to medium term. And so does this not set a precedent for all the properties that are sitting outside the growth management boundary if we were to proceed? Like, could there not be a domino effect here?
Through you, Chair, I think that is a possibility. I don't know if it's a domino effect, but yes, I mean, once we have the policies in place and we have met the population threshold, it allows consideration for council of other applications as well. It doesn't set a precedent, but it opens that door to consideration.
So, and the other thing I just wanted to challenge is around this idea of have we reached 75% of the infill? And you said it's hard to know, but like Oceanfront hasn't developed, Redbridge hasn't developed, the two properties we rezoned haven't developed, Chikai Fen hasn't developed, and we haven't implemented any of our infill policy to try and densify along the transit corridor. There's still room in the downtown core for higher density. So like, to me, that seems like a lot of space that we can still move into before we have to move outside the growth management boundary. So couldn't we safely say we're not at 75%?
Absolutely. We are definitely not at 75%.
Okay. Thank you.
Councillor Stoner.
Thank you. I just want to follow up on one of Councillor Pettingill's questions around the steep slopes DPA. My understanding is that that was already earmarked for staff work in 2021, or is that going to be contingent on developer funding one way or another?
Through you, Chair. At this point, it's contingent, so it's earmarked as a project for us to work at. But I believe through the budget process, we have not assigned any budget for it. So it would be subject to, you know, a grant or somebody prepared to fund the project other than the district.
Thank you for the clarification. That's it for me.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Pettingill, I saw your hand again.
Yeah, thank you. I guess a bit of a process question. If I was of the opinion that, you know, I could make a decision about the growth management boundary, so I, you know, was thinking about the first option before us, you know, I don't know where the rest of council is, but what, you know, if we start down the road of making that amendment and having some, you know, possibly a public hearing and readings and so on, what is our capacity if we, you know, through the conversation decide, oh, actually, we do want some more information, we want some more studies before going to the next reading? What is the ability to do some of the work that is discussed in the second option? Like, can we do all the stuff in the second option as well in the first option if that's where we go, or just trying to understand that?
Well, I think going with the second option does not in any way preclude the decision that council would eventually make on the application, whether to approve it or not. I think that the proponent I know has already completed some studies. They haven't been fully vetted by us, as it will require additional staff resources. So I think if council needs more information, significantly more or considerably more information, our preference would be to try to resource this process because it will take staff resources.
Sorry, just if I may clarify. So I am coming close to a point where I feel like I have enough information to make a decision, but I just want to know if I head down that road and the rest of council isn't of that opinion, are we then precluded, if we take the first option, from going back and getting some of that information if the rest of council is of the opinion they want more information? Like, is the only way to get information to take option 2 as the path?
No, I don't believe so. I think council could, issue the first motion and attach conditions to it that, before it comes back, X, Y, and Z needs to be done, sort of thing.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Pettingill. And I'm conscious of time because we've used up the full hour that we had budgeted for this item. Councillor Race, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be quick. Mr. Belnishkis, my recollection of the 34,000 figure that appears in the policy is that number represented, in the planning department gave us an analysis when we were talking about the OCP last term. It represented, in effect, the infill capability that more or less existed at that time, including some of these future developments we've dealt with recently, like the Crumpet Woods area and so forth. Is that correct? I think that is where that number came from.
Through you, Chair, that's correct. It was a very high level analysis of infill opportunities, and I would say that we've since then looked at it a bit more, and how the recent changes that we've seen with Loggers East neighborhood plan would affect those numbers, and the recent changes and the knowledge we've developed would affect. So I think it would require to determine the infill of the potential. I think that 34,000 number might change.
But still a high level number, absolutely.
Yeah, it's a very high level number.
Yeah, thank you, Chair.
Okay, Council. Councillor Anderson.
Thank you. I would like to move the recommendation, the second component of it, and I'll read it out. So we have two potential recommendations, and I'll be focusing on after the or. That the Committee of the Whole receive and provide feedback on the introduction of a Provincial Community Plan amendment to extend the growth management boundary and redesignate district lots 509 and 510 to residential neighborhoods. Staff report dated December 8th as follows. And that council directs staff to develop a comprehensive application review process and come back to council for endorsement prior to implementation. So the second option rather than the first, and I'd be happy to speak to it, Chair.
Very good. And Council, is there a seconder? Councillor Race, seconds. Go ahead, Councillor Anderson, followed by Councillor Race.
Generally, I am satisfied with the level of compliance that we have today. As elicited by staff. Some further considerations occur to me as follows. With respect to OCP 92A, the origins of I'll call it the special status, if you like, of lots 509 and 510 go back some time. They go back to prior to the 1998 OCP, and a substantial community dialogue at that time concerning not growth management, but forestry practices. The special status of these two lots was carried over in a growth management strategy report in 2005, which was not produced with the same standards and considerations as we have today in the most recent OCP. And I'm concerned generally that there has been this special status is simply not defensible. With respect to 9.2B, as I have spoke during the recent OCP 2017-2018 public hearings, I'm concerned that the trade-offs in the current policy 9.2B is underestimated. They are underestimated with respect to habitat, infrastructure, competing land uses on our valley bottoms. And I've said this often, and I think that we only keep being reminded of these issues. We should also be aware of the fact that there is only one taxpayer, and that one taxpayer also pays for the hazard mitigation that we need in our valley bottom, the diking. With respect to 509, 510, the infrastructure costs keep coming up an issue. Well, we have infrastructure costs in these other areas as well. There are significant development obstacle issues of varying kinds in the list of areas that we're supposed to be addressing first in residential development. I think that we have to face that there's a lot of trade-offs here and a complicated picture. I'm impressed with the experience of the petitioners and the correspondence that we've received from over the recent months. We have some very long-time Garibaldi Highlands residents included with some, I think, some observations that based on experience and notably regarding transportation issues in Garibaldi Highlands. I'm satisfied that the issues and policy development needs have been well identified by staff. And I'm especially comforted with the fact that the infrastructure maintenance issues have been very much highlighted, and look forward to further review of these, I'm sure. With respect to 9.2H and the steep slopes DPA policy, which is outstanding, here we have an opportunity to facilitate this with the offer of the applicant, as has been mentioned. Finally, we have trailhead issues that keep coming to us from this neighborhood, the Pia and Upper Perth. And we have transportation planning issues affecting the area, but also other adjacent neighborhoods and future developments below. These are needing review and best or most optimally in the context of this proposed comprehensive review being undertaken or completed. Thank you.
Councillor Race.
Thank you. And I seconded this partly for discussion and partly because I didn't like the first alternative. Having gone through these discussions, and I have the benefit of that over most of council last term, and the reasons for the growth management boundary and what prompted staff and the council at that time to go through it. It was, to put it into one or two sentences, it was to try to direct growth to already developed areas as opposed to spreading out into greenfield areas. And unless there was a really good reason. And so that's kind of been my guiding thing. As I look at this, I am content with staff's calculation and view of the population of Squamish. Instinctively, to me, it doesn't seem like it is going down, it's going up. So I don't have an issue with that. However, the other policies and the exceptions to me are pretty firm. And so my feedback is that we should not deal with this at this time. I'm not happy with the idea of the majority of residential development. I'm happy with that concept. This to me goes outside of it. We have very significant undeveloped lands or partly developed lands within the growth management boundary. It doesn't include the two large lots that we just rezoned from single family to other densities in the last go around of the zoning. Those alone are very significant developments and will provide a lot of sort of new neighborhood development, plus the existing neighborhoods that aren't completely filled out, like the oceanfront, waterfront landing, and the list goes on. Chikai Fan and so forth. So I don't think we need it. I think it does not comply with 9.2B, which would be directing the majority of development to some existing neighborhood areas. When you consider that the majority of the development would be taken up perhaps even by those two large single family or former single family developments that we dealt with the last time. I'm trying to sort of step back and look at the larger picture of this, and you know, we've all received a lot of pressure from the proponent. We've received a lot of emails and correspondence from the public. It was mentioned that maybe, you know, when is the next community plan review, OCP review. Well, I can tell you that the first one I was involved in, we passed in 2011, and that had been underway for about 11 years, if I recall correctly. The second one we passed in 2018. It took about a year and a half, I think, to do that, and that was really light speed for an OCP review, and took a lot of staff time. We sourced that internally, and there was 2 senior planners who were seconded to work on that alone for that period of time. So we might consider starting one in a couple of years, but it's not a fast process. It would take a couple of years probably for a full OCP review, plus all the resources that are involved. It might be, though, that that is an appropriate time to consider this. And I think that, you know, if this ever did go out through to public engagement of any kind, right now there's public information meetings going on. We see the results of those. That's the developer's perspective. But I think before this has any kind of significant public review at any point, we would want to have some kind of a sense of what the offer on the table was, as opposed to public benefit. The other things in here to me are public negatives. They would have to be evaluated, of course. But what's missing in that concept is, where's the benefit to the public? Why would we go outside of our growth management boundary prior to our population hitting 34,000 people? Why would we go into greenfield areas when we have areas within the growth boundary that have not yet been developed? So I think that fundamentally would have to be answered. So I will provide that feedback, that I don't think we should proceed at this point for those reasons, notwithstanding the fact that I'm going to vote for the motion, depending what the other feedback is. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Pettingill.
Yeah, thank you. I am at this point not prepared to support this motion. When I look at our policies and what's being discussed, it doesn't meet the threshold for me. I see our growth management boundary not just in the policies, but philosophically as a cornerstone of this OCP, which had a lot of dialogue, including some dialogue on this property, and a lot of public consultation. And from my perspective, this is effectively a significant OCP change for, you know, the purpose of one development. And I understand there's a lot of work that goes into an OCP. From my perspective, an OCP discussion is the time to reconsider this. I think, you know, it has been fairly recently reconsidered. And, you know, I do agree with my fellow councillor that there's a huge amount of development opportunities still within the growth management boundaries. And I guess that's why I don't see this as being a big part of why I don't see this as being compliant with our current policies. The other piece, there was some mention made that there are issues with developing some of our priority areas downtown and so on. And be that as it may, I think, again, that is something to discuss as part of an OCP review. What's proposed here does nothing to address that. And so all those issues stay unaddressed. And we have more sprawling out if we go ahead with this. And so that's why I think I'm not comfortable sort of looking at this as a solution to what some people may perceive with other policies in the OCP. And so, you know, my current inclination actually at this point would be to move the first recommendation, and I would likely then vote to defeat it when it came to us with the information I have at this point. But I am open to hearing what my fellow councillors would have to say.
Thank you. Mary Arlette.
Thank you. I am a little bit worried with some of the comments that I've heard that there's some confusion between the first and second one. My understanding from staff is that if we do not want this to proceed, then the first motion would have been the one to support, and that the second one actually directs the start of the comprehensive review of the application. And with the chair's discretion, it might be timely to confirm that, but I'll proceed with my comments. To me, the OCP was a very strong indication from our community that growth should be managed, and that these policies were put in place especially 9.2B, around making sure that we were using the land to its highest and best use in the footprint that we currently occupy, rather than sprawling more. I believe this is a dangerous precedent. It would be like a python swallowing a pig. It will take up a lot of time. When we have a lot of issues around growth, we still need to get right. I think we should review our CAC policy around the percentage of affordable housing that we're including in rezonings. I don't think it's high enough. We haven't seen the DPA, wildfire DPA, and its potential impact on housing affordability. We haven't nearly finished our discussion on the missing middle housing piece. And we have, my understanding is that the trail inventory is just underway. All of these pieces were identified by the previous council to make sure that we had significant policy in place before we started these discussions, before we understood what density we would allow on these lands that are outside the growth management boundary, that have steep slopes, that are above that, parts above that 200-meter mark. These all have implications. So I think we need to be ready. We have not seen the oceanfront start to develop its residential area. We have not seen the Chikai Fan move forward. We have not seen the full development of Waterfront Landing. Red Bridge just got the first part of its DP, but nothing more. There's just so much land available, and we have to keep having conversations with our community about how to build out community hubs and walkable neighborhoods. And we need to get that right before we start expanding outside of our growth management boundaries. So to me, the motion that should have been put forward was the first one, and respecting the wishes of our community when this OCP was approved. So I will not be supporting this motion.
Mr. Valeniskis, I agree with the mayor. There does appear to be some confusion around the OR situation. You did cover it in your report. Will you take a quick moment to just clarify?
Yes. Thank you for the opportunity. So the first motion, the council directs staff to bring forward the bylaw for consideration, really would indicate that council does not deem that there's sufficient alignment between OCP policies and the application, and the level of analysis is enough for council to make a decision on the bylaw application. The second the second and the third motion, which are together, would indicate that there's enough level of compliance to start the process of comprehensive review.
Thanks for that clarification. And to be clear, the motion under consideration is the portion after the OR. Councillor Race, we've already heard from you, so I'm going to go to Councillor Stoner, but I acknowledge that you'd like to speak.
Thank you, through the chair. Appreciate the clarification of the motions that are in front of us. With respect to the motion that's on the table, I will not be supporting it at this time. Just generally speaking, I think it's too soon to be considering a comprehensive application review process. We may be at the 22.5 population mark, give or take, but we aren't anywhere near the 75% infill development. And so I don't think that this aligns with 9.2B, and I do think that there are not complete. And I think having our ducks in a row before we have this conversation with the community is really important, so that we can be clear about what that conversation is about. I feel like if this goes to comprehensive review now and out towards public engagement, that it'll be confused in terms of what it is that we're actually defining and looking for in terms of the pros and cons of growth management boundary, and will be muddled with some of the proposals that have been put on the table by the developer that are not necessarily 100% in line with the direction that our policies are going, because they're still under development. So the wildfire DPA, the steep slopes DPA, Our missing middle housing is not there yet, and that is a critical component to opening up the growth management boundary. And like the mayor, I just think that this has the risk of setting precedent. And a lot of work has been done both by previous council and by our community to establish that growth management boundary. I just don't think it's fair to that previous work, to the previous engagement process that we've gone through with our community to open that up sooner than that 2023 mark that we have in the policy.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Race, I'm going to put myself on the list and then come to you unless Councillor Herford expresses an interest in speaking. Yes, okay. Councillor Herford, you go ahead and I'll save my remarks after you're finished.
Thank you. I appreciate Mr. Vilnius's clarification of the two motions, and I do feel like I'd like to know more. I do see the value in having our even more completed policy work and in place before considering these the development on this property, or really anywhere outside the growth management boundary. But I think we can all agree that policy work's never really done, as we're all here just building on the policy that we've had come forward. So I would like to know, more. I'd like to know what the community thinks of more. So I will be supporting this motion, but it does not mean that it's a blanket support of the extension. I would like to have the more in-depth evaluation done, so we have a little more granular information rather than the extremely high level that we've been dealing with here. So I'll be supporting this motion at this time, but I will be curious to hear what Councillor Race has to say and others. So that's where I am right now. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Herford. And for my own thoughts, the principal question that we're being asked by staff is, should a comprehensive planning and community consultation process with respect to growth management policies of the official community plan begin? And I believe that the answer is yes. Once staff is directed to adjust the growth management boundary, a long process will begin. A detailed roadmap for the application process will be created. The resources needed to proceed will be identified, and a work plan will be created. A sub-area plan will be drafted. That would be reviewed against a much broader range of policies in the official community plan. Various government agencies will be consulted, and stakeholders will also be asked to provide feedback, including existing residents. This isn't going to be a rush to development. It's going to be years, many years, before any shovels get into the ground. And I predict it'll be many more years than what we saw in the report. 2024 seems completely unrealistic as a potential landing date for any development on these two properties. So in the staff report, we're informed that the first phase of development, 2024, I submit that it's likely closer to 2027, and I'd be surprised if it came any earlier than that. And while the sub-area plan and other policy work is being done, we'll continue infilling within our existing neighborhoods. And one of the advantages of developing this site in the future is the fact that it is out of the floodplain. It doesn't require any significant mitigation devices like we're seeing potentially protecting northern Brackendale from debris flow coming off of out of the Chikai River. I support the motion, and I will now go to Councillor Race.
Thank you. And I confess I was one of the councillors confused to remark on the mayor's comments. My purpose in seconding this was to provide the feedback because I thought that it would help staff to have feedback. What I forgot to do when I spoke the first time was to move an amendment to take out the second bullet directing staff to start preparing a plan, because I didn't think this was appropriate. However, the simplest way might be just to deal with the first part of it So I will also be voting against this motion with the thought that the other one will be put on the table and we will vote on that.
Thank you, Councillor Race. Mayor Elliott.
Thank you. It's really great to hear all of my colleagues' comments about this. And it's also really important to remember that we have a whole OCP to contemplate and not just the section around growth management. And so one of the reasons that I don't think we should proceed is that we are working in good faith on the policy options that have been listed here in this section, and they will get completed, and I believe are getting completed in a timely manner. And so it's not about, you know, the policy work never getting done. We need this work. It needs to be done. We need to understand the impact of wildfire. We need to understand the impact of steep slopes. We need to have that trail inventory. We have to have missing middle housing policy because it makes our other neighborhoods better. And so waiting before we open 400 acres of land to development, I think is prudent. The other thing that we didn't have back in 2018 that we absolutely have now is a climate emergency declaration and a community climate action plan. And I believe we need to make progress on those 6 big moves and start to change the way that we see normal in our developments to a whole new paradigm around climate-friendly development and people-centered development. So none of that was contemplated in a deep way in the growth management restrictions developed in 2018, but it absolutely needs to be part of our thinking now. And finally, the other piece in the OCP that I reflect on is the neighborhood planning process. And we've done one, and we have other areas that are under a lot of pressure. And so expanding the boundary now, before we've even understood the impact of growth on our existing major neighborhoods, how folks believe that we incorporate that walkable community hub into existing neighborhoods, how our community feels around incorporating more density in a sustainable and human-centered way, that's really important before we have these big conversations about what to do with these huge greenfield developments. And so, you know, this isn't just about one landowner's property. It's about making sure that growth happens in the right way. And we certainly know that we get it right sometimes and not right other times. But I think those conversations are so fundamental to have in the next few years before we unleash this huge, and it will be huge, process around something that's outside the growth management boundary. You know, I think that it is, with all due respect, a bit naive to say that the timing is so far out. Yeah, some things will take time, but developers have the ability to hire a contract planner. And we've seen developments move very quickly, Waterfront Landing and Garibaldi Springs being 2 of those. So don't underestimate the ability of developers to move things along quite quickly. Those are my final thoughts. I would ask my colleagues to reconsider that are voting for this motion. I think there's a lot of important things we need to do before we entertain big greenfield development. Thank you.
Councillor Stoner.
Thank you. I was just going to echo some of the things the mayor just mentioned that came to mind that I wanted to reiterate based off my previous comments. I think one of the key things for me in terms of recognizing the process and the value and the time that's been put into the OCP previously is that staff capacity and council time is not unlimited. So even though there is developer funding on the table for some capacity, for some additional capacity within staff, that still takes up staff's time and it still takes up our time, and it shifts our focus away from things that we know are really critical and time sensitive in our existing areas that are seeing growth and development. So I think that it is really important to focus on those areas that we know are already challenging. As the mayor pointed out, we know that there is neighborhood planning that needs to happen in areas that are really, really ripe for development and are within our growth management boundary at this time. And shifting our focus to a very large project that is not about just this one lot. It's not about this one developer. It's about how we develop outside of our growth management boundary. I think is not a conversation that we want to be having at this time, given the other things that we know are really time sensitive and urgent on our plate.
Thank you, Councillor Stoner. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, I will call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Councillor Stoner, Mayor Elliott, Councillor Pettingill, and Councillor Race oppose. The motion fails. Mayor Elliott.
I would like to move the first recommendation of staff.
And that is seconded by Councillor Stoner. Would you like to speak to that, Mayor Elliott?
I think my comments all still apply, and that I don't believe this is the work we need to be doing right now. I think we need to be managing growth within our growth management boundary. We still have pain points there, and we need to fix those, and we need to be focused on those. So I think that is the work of this council, not expanding into greenfield development.
Is there any further discussion? Councillor Pettingill.
Yeah, I just want to highlight, I think I do feel like I have the information to move ahead with this as it is. I think there are, as I mentioned, big discussions to have about, including, what are the obstacles to developing downtown in the valley floor versus in other areas outside the growth management boundary. But I think that is a discussion to have in the context of an official community plan that looks at things holistically and not just one development. And so for those reasons, and I appreciate the comments of many of my colleagues, I share many of them, I will be supporting this.
Councillor Anderson.
Thank you. I will be supporting this motion, but I also wish to go on the record regarding one of the issues that's been discussed. I do, in fact, think that Lot 509 and 510 have had special status and targeted treatment that has been unfair. So in other words, it has been stated it's not about this one lot or this developer. In fact, I think it is too much so about this one lot, one developer. The history is there since the mid-1990s. And I think that it has unique circumstances within the areas that are left outside of our current growth management boundary. There's a very challenging infrastructure, road infrastructure needs to be put in place for other key areas that may belong in the future of residential development. I don't think this fits in the same basket. So I just wish to register my concern that we are targeting this lot and this landowner. Thank you. I will be supporting, however, this motion.
Very good. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor and opposed? Councillor Race, I'm just checking in with you.
We are dealing with the first bullet point, council directs staff to bring forward an amendment bylaw for consideration. Is that the motion we're dealing with?
Yes.
And I'm going by previous comments that if we didn't want to see this proceed, we should vote this down.
That is not the case.
So what are we asking staff to do with this resolution?
Mayor Elliott, I'll go to you, and Mr. Valeniscus has his hand up for clarification as well.
I'm going to try and allow staff to stay outside the debate, but for clarity, by bringing it forward based on the information we have in front of us now, council would have the opportunity to approve or defeat it, Councillor Race. So we can't defeat it today. It has to come back to us. And then we would have the opportunity then to approve or defeat. And hopefully that clarifies your vote.
Thank you. It does. And I thought that the reference was to this motion itself. I beg your pardon. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
So just to clarify, are you voting in favor? Okay. Councillor French is opposed. The motion passes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Valeniskis. Council, we clearly spent a lot more time on this than we were anticipating. I do wish to take a 10-minute break, so we will come back, please, at 1:45. Good afternoon and welcome back to Committee of the Whole. Our next item shows up as number 2 on our agenda, 2020 Solid Waste Composition and Recycling Regulation Update. And Nicole Steglich, the Integrated Solid Waste Specialist, is with us. And I believe, Nicole, you're taking it over from here?
I will, thank you. Good afternoon, Mayor, Council, staff, community members. Thank you for the introduction. I'm Nicole Steglich, Integrated Solid Waste Specialist. And with me today for this report are Jeff Wint, our Outreach Sustainability Coordinator, and Wilbert Yang, Senior Engineer with Tetra Tech. So we've had some important conversations lately about our waste, about the expansion of the landfill, fees for solid waste services for the district. Today, we'll continue the conversation with an update on the composition of our waste. I'll start by providing a brief review of major solid waste milestones in the past 5 years. Then I will hand the presentation over to Wilbert to provide an update on the waste composition audit that he and his team completed for us this summer. And finally, I'll provide a brief update of our 2021 work plan and budget as it relates to waste diversion, and teed up nicely for Jeff Wint to speak to some of the great initiatives in progress and planned for 2021 to increase our waste diversion. Solid waste disposal. So here we have a chart that shows our solid waste disposal data since 2008. So as you can see, the trend is what we want it to be, which is going down. And this disposal rate, this is, as you may be aware, this is where we take all of the waste that is generated in Squamish and disposed of at the Squamish landfill, and we divide that by our population. The provincial target that we see in the red box of 350 kilograms per person, that aligns with our zero waste strategy, which came into place in 2016. In 2017, we updated the solid waste bylaw to make it mandatory for multifamily homes and for businesses to separate out their organics and their recyclables. In 2018, as you know, the official community plan was adopted with a corresponding council strategic plan that set our target per capita disposal rate of 300 kilograms per capita, as we see for 2021. To support the bylaw updates, an outreach sustainability coordinator was hired in 2019, and the bulk of the focus of that position became on the single-use items bylaw, which was adopted at the end of 2019. And as we know, 2020, COVID. This had impacts on our waste disposal rates, as well as the use of single-use items. Also in 2020, we had the province release their intention paper to expand the recycling regulation. So this is where they were seeking feedback on expanding to additional material categories to be covered by extended producer responsibility, making producers responsible for disposal of materials at the end of life instead of municipalities and regional districts. Go into more detail on that proposed recycling regulation update within the report. And for this presentation, we'd like to focus on our waste, the 2020 waste composition. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Wilbert. I will stop sharing my screen if I can.
You're still on mute, Ms. Steglich, or you are on mute.
Thank you so much. So Wilbert Yang is senior engineer with Tetra Tech and has been involved in the 2018 and the 2016 waste composition studies, so maybe a familiar face. Thank you.
Mr. Yang, we are not hearing your audio. You're showing on my screen as being, okay, that is now off mute. Go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Perfect. All right, great. Well, thank you very much for having me, and I will give you a little update on the waste audit that we completed this year. And do you see my screen right now?
Yes.
Okay, all right. And so just to give an update, this is the overview of the project that we did this summer. It is an audit of the waste disposed in 2020. It will be following the, it'll be tracking some of the information that we did since 2016. And it's important to recognize that this was conducted on the third week of August, and it really just provides a snapshot of the types of materials that are disposed at the landfill. In terms of how many samples we collected 8 samples from single-family households, 6 samples from multifamily, 6 from commercial sources, 6 from construction and demolition activities, and we were also able to collect some samples for streetscapes. In terms of what we saw in the single-family sector, what was really interesting was the fact that the amount of organics in the waste stream has gone down considerably. So from a proportional perspective, this is 10% less than what was there the previous time when we did the waste audit. But what was interesting is at the same time, the amount of plastics and the amount of paper increased proportionally as well too. So, but still, what was interesting is that the organics is by far the largest material category for the single-family waste stream. For the multifamily sector, certainly there's a lot more organics found in the waste stream, but at the same time, we also found that there was an increase in the amount of paper and plastics as well. For commercial sources, slightly less organics in the waste stream, but certainly a noticeable amount of plastics and paper in the waste stream. We also looked at demolition construction activities, and what we found was that there was a lot of bagged garbage in the system, and we also found a lot of organics. What's interesting about organics from the construction and demolition sector is that most of that organics is wood waste or wood material. So one of the new things that we did this year that we didn't do last time was streetscapes. So streetscapes it's important because it makes up about 1% of the waste stream, but it is just looking at what people are throwing out in the downtown areas, as well as other areas such as bus stops, crosswalks, and so forth. So what we found in the waste stream was a lot of household hygiene, and that is primarily pet waste. But we also saw a fair amount of organics as well as paper and plastics. So overall, in terms of what's being disposed from the district, a big chunk of it is still organics, about 30%, recognizing that the last time we had this, it was significantly more organics in the waste stream. And there is also the next largest components are paper and plastics, and those percentages have gone up. It's important to recognize that this is percentages, so there's quite a large decrease in organics, so proportionally paper and plastics look larger than what it was before. When we look at what kind of diversion services that are available at the district and looking at what kind of materials that are in the waste stream that could be disposed, what we found is a diversion potential of about 70%, a little over 70% of the material could diverted away from disposal. So disposal, in terms of what could be diverted, it could be the organic waste stream, which is still about almost a third of the waste stream, and that can go into your curbside compostable program, organics program. There's still a fair amount of recyclables, and there are materials that can be dropped off at the landfill at the drop-off depot, as well as wood materials that could be used as a fuel. One thing that was also included in this audit was looking at single-use items. And what we found is single-use items represent about 5% of the waste stream, which was quite interesting from our perspective. We found that in the various sectors, they vary. So single-family and multifamily was about 3.5%. The ICI sector certainly had a lot more at 6%. And in terms of what we saw at the streetscapes, definitely it was almost 10% of the waste stream. The main categories of single-use items that we found were takeout containers, both paper and plastics. We also saw a lot of single-use cups, which is typical of your Starbucks and your Tim Hortons, and we also saw a lot of retail bags. What was interesting is because we now have 3 years of waste audit data, we can actually see how things have shifted over time. And the good news is that for the past 4 years, we can show that the amount of materials disposed has continued to grow or continued to shrink over time. And what we could also see is that the amount of organics in the waste stream has certainly started reducing. But when we look at the 2020 numbers, you can also see that the amount of paper and plastics are a little bit more, and we're not sure whether that's a function of COVID or not, but certainly it's something to keep your eye on. So in terms of summarizing the findings of the audit, certainly organics is still one of the largest material streams, and there's certainly a lot of opportunity for more diversion in that particular category. What was interesting as well is that the amount of paper and plastics is increasing, but the good news overall is that the disposal rate continues to shrink, and it is now currently around 500 kilograms per capita. And that's my presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Yang. Ms. Deglish, did I hear correctly? We're now moving over to Mr. Wint.
We are going to be moving over. What I'll do, I'll ask Mr. Yang to stop sharing his screen, and then I will pull up our, thank you, and then I'll get back into the presentation that we started in. Okay, thank you for your patience. I think we're almost in. Perfect. Okay, so again, thank you to Mr. Yang, Wilbert, for presenting the results of the 2020 solid waste composition. Sorry about that. Now that we've looked at what's in our garbage by source, I think it's really helpful to look at the disposal tons by source to inform where we can get the most bang for our buck to decrease disposal rates. So in this table, you can see that the waste that's coming from businesses, from industry, commercial properties, institutional properties, that makes up 47% of what's going into the Squamish landfill by weight. Next up is the residential sector. So that's from our single family homes, from our multifamily homes, townhouses, apartments. That's 31% of the waste in Squamish. Next up is construction and demolition waste material at 12%. As Wilbert mentioned, streetscapes are a small fraction of our waste at less than 1%. So when we look ahead to 2021, and we look at, so we're talking about where are we going to get the most bang for our buck? What will we be investing our time and our resources in? And that's in 3 things. So it's education and enforcement on the solid waste bylaw, specific to multifamily properties, businesses, construction demolition sites. We're looking at planning and outreach to support waste diversion in general, as well as pre-design for infrastructure that is going to provide more opportunities to take materials back so that they can be properly managed. From a budget perspective, in addition to staff time and what's included in the work plans, we're looking at approximately $110,000 to invest in solid waste diversion. So that's going to be $20,000 in educational programs, events to promote waste diversion, as well as $85,000 in pre-design for infrastructure. That includes pre-design for an additional recycling depot to serve the community, as well as built into the concept design for the landfill expansion is going to be looking at an expansion of the transfer station and the recycling depot there to increase diversion. And so with that, I'd like to hand it over to Jeff Wint, Mr. Wint, as the Outreach Sustainability Coordinator. He's going to be able to share with you some of the progress that he's already made since joining the team in late September on outreach and education, as well as what's in place, what's planned for 2021. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. Hello, everyone. So this is just a high-level look at some of the reduction initiatives that we are undertaking and that we will be undertaking next year. So looking at the residential waste, one of the opportunities we have is to work with GFL to continue to do the lid lift audits on all curbside streams. So in the past, we've done this just a couple times a year and really just focused on recycling and organics. This winter and into the spring, we've got an opportunity to look at all the streams, so including waste in that, which is going to give us some more insight into what's going into that residential waste and where we can help residents to do some reduction. We're also working with property management companies and stratas to identify those multifamily properties that are not yet in compliance with the solid waste bylaw, help them come into compliance or move forward with enforcement on that. And then we're also distributing the countertop organics bins that we have to help those residents start doing that diversion. So on that, we've distributed 167 of them in the last couple of weeks, and we have another 770 of them to distribute in the coming months. So that's going to help those, again, those multifamily properties that aren't currently in compliance, getting into compliance so that we can start getting that reduction from them. Next slide, Nicole. Thank you. And then as Wilbert mentioned, the construction and demolition still has a significant amount of wood waste. So we are doing ongoing visits, myself with a bylaw officer to construction sites to do enforcement. As you can see from these pictures here, those visits are getting some change in their behavior. So the first picture is what one particular construction site was putting in their waste. You can see a mix of plastics and different materials in with the wood. On the next visit, a couple days later, after providing the information, we found a bin of just wood waste. So that's going to be able to be diverted, whereas that first load we're not able to divert. We will also be receiving in the next week a study on deconstruction and demolition waste policies. That's going to be an overview of what is currently in place here in the District of Squamish, as well as some recommendations on how we can move forward, either through policy suggestions or other ways that we can support the construction and demolition industry so that we can get that diversion and we can get all that wood waste out of the landfill. With ICI and restaurants in particular, since they are the big volume producers, in recognition that they are still undergoing some different operations with respect to COVID, we're taking a little bit of a softer approach. So reaching out to them to make sure that they know that the organics collection is expected of them and is required. We have toolkits and guides to help them come into compliance. But at this point, it is still a softer approach. And with that, we'd like to open up to any questions.
Very good. Thank you. Council. are there any questions? I see Councillor Anderson's hand. Go ahead, Councillor.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I'd like to refer staff to Attachment 1, Table 3, and just ask for some clarification of terms. Specifically, if you could just clarify your usage of wood in for diversion and just below it, steel and wood out. If you could just clarify how you're using those phrasings.
Absolutely. Thank you, Councillor Anderson, for bringing that up. In that table, it has to do with how the tons are measured into the landfill and then balanced for materials that, like wood in for diversion is like wood that goes across the scales into the transfer station. And then there's the weights are collected of the wood that is weighed out that goes to GFL for processing. So it's just a matter of taking the wood waste out of the equation and only counting what's going into the landfill.
Thank you. I'm going to, for a next question regarding the timing of the survey, and this may of course have come up last time too, but I may be repeating myself, but I'll start with reading a phrase from the consultant's report, and it comes up on page 8. It is important to recognize that waste composition audits provide a snapshot of the waste stream during each sampling period, and variances in composition can be decreased with more samples that also take into account considerable seasonality, unquote. So my question is, what considerations are there in the choice of the August time period? And would you is this a matter of interest to vary that time period next time, or to account for factors that would be better taken into account in another period of the year? I hope I'm clear enough. It's whether what considerations are there in that August time period, and what are we missing in the way of information potentially?
That's a great question, or through the chair, Councillor Anderson, thank you for raising that question. With respect to the selection of that time frame, it was, I think that the team at Tetra Tech that was doing the audit, they got to experience, I think, one of the hottest days of the summer at the start of the week, coupled with the windiest and wettest close to the end of the week. So in their mind, it would not have been the ideal time frame. That wasn't conscious in terms of August. The thinking was, let's get a snapshot of the composition over this week in time and use the data that's coming from that to get again, at a snapshot, like the relative percentages of each of those material streams, recognizing that, you know, across an annual basis, there could be, you know, a little bit more in some months of, let's say, food scraps, or a little bit less in other months. And so what I'd like to do is my understanding is that it's quite common for municipalities to select a week-long period, just get everything set up, do it all in one chunk of time, and then just look at the general trends. And what I'd like to do is to turn it over to Wilbert to ask about what else is done when other municipalities are doing similar studies.
Thank you. I have a final comment to make, Chair, if that's all right. I'll try to be brief.
Well, Councillor Anderson, just before, I believe the thought was that we'd hear from Mr. Yang. Ms. Douglas, is that what you were intending? Please. Go ahead, Mr. Yang. And we're not hearing your audio.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you
go
hear
ahead.
me?
Yes, please.
All right.
Go ahead.
So in the ideal situation, you want to do like 2 or 3 or possibly even 4 samples or audits over the course of the year, so you see the seasonality in terms of how the composition of the waste stream changes over time. But in terms of what happened at the district, we just kind of wanted to see what happened as a snapshot. And what we did was we tried to keep that time frame pretty consistent to when the first samples were taken, so that typically in that time of year, this is what we saw in terms of the waste stream. So it really is a matter of, coming out once a year and seeing how it's changing in that time of the year. But certainly it's always better in terms of an understanding of the waste stream that if you do 3 to 4 different times of the year. So you can see how the composition changes with the seasons.
Thank you.
Well,
I would like to refer to a passage in the report to council discussing wood waste and addressing its definitions. And I'll just quote, approximately 28.5% of construction and demolition waste is wood that could be reused, composted, or used for energy regeneration or energy generation. I would just like to add the observation that there is another fourth use, and it is related to energy generation, and that is that construction and demolition wood waste can be blended with other lesser grade wood wastes in land remediation. 11 to 13 years ago, a very large and unique land remediation project took place at Waterfront Landing. In fact, we wouldn't see a development there today without that project, and it was only able to be done with the blending of clean, dry wood waste from construction and demolition with the wet material that was below ground. Otherwise, the material below ground was unsaleable. So just the point is that wood waste, clean wood waste, can have a role in land remediation to bring forward product that can be used for energy generation. And I think it's an important footnote because we have dozens and dozens of acres of land that we may be looking at for remediation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Anderson. Next, I have Councillor Stoner.
Thank you. Through the chair, great to see this report come forward and great to see that that per capita number decreasing, perhaps not as quickly as we would like it to, but the progress on the organics in particular is encouraging. I'm wondering if staff can just provide an update on the single-use items bylaw in terms of implementation. I have a feeling that that was maybe upset a little bit by COVID in terms of our timing. And just wondering if staff can speak to that.
Mr. Wint.
Through the chair, yes, unfortunately, COVID did disrupt the outreach and enforcement of that bylaw.
Mr. Wint, your audio is very choppy. I wonder if I could request you turn your video off in the hopes that it preserves your bandwidth so we can hear you better.
Is that a bit better? Yeah, perfect.
That sounds like an improvement. Go ahead.
Great. So through the chair, yes, COVID did disrupt the single-use item bylaw enforcement. Through March, April, there was some uncertainty around the hygiene of reusables. Many retailers actually banned people bringing in reusable bags. Since that point, we have seen voluntary compliance start, particularly with the larger grocery chains throughout the district. And we are looking at approaches to start with the education and outreach of that in the new year.
Great, thanks for the update. And then it was really interesting to see the streetscapes component included in the waste diversion audit this year. And I'm just curious if we have considered adding recyclable or organic bins next to our trash bins, especially in the downtown core, where we're seeing that high rate of recyclables.
Ms. Steglich?
Thank you, Councillor Stoner, for raising that question about the streetscapes bins. And yeah, as we saw in the 4 samples that were collected, actually 2 of those were specific to the downtown core. And we did see that there was substantial organics, over 20% in there. And So what we've got in our community climate action plan, we've targeted to have bins for organics in streetscapes where it makes sense to within the next 2 to 7 years. And so our intent is to, now that we have some samples, there are a limited number of samples, but we're getting a general sense of the composition. So now that we have that information, we're planning to have conversations with Public Works about the logistics of collection, because they're doing the collection now, as well as to have conversation with planning as they're putting together their guidelines for streetscapes for the downtown core, and to look at where it makes most sense, likely to establish some criteria for where to locate organic bins. There's also, with respect to recyclable bins, there's the product steward for refundable containers that is providing or is able to provide some collection containers for those at no cost. So that's something that Jeff and I are going to be working on in the new year as well, to look at the feasibility of adding those containers. Thank you.
Anything further, Councillor Stoner? Very good. We'll go to Mayor Elliott. Oh, sorry. I have Councillor Pettingill, followed by Mayor Elliott.
Thank you. It's really interesting digging through this data. And I'm just wondering, we heard about the sampling in August. I'm wondering, with the annual per capita estimate, is that based solely on the August sampling, or did we weigh everything coming into the landfill for the year and then we divided it up by what we saw in August? Or how are we getting to this sort of final 540 some odd kilograms per capita?
So through the chair, for the per capita disposal rate, so that's where we take on an annual basis. We get to the end of the year and we look at our scale software, how much waste has come in, the tonnage of waste that's gone into the landfill, and then we get the latest population estimates from the province and calculate the disposal rate.
Okay, thank you. And then do we have a sense of why we're seeing increases? I understand it's not just percentage increases, but absolute increases in paper waste. Is that, do we know packaging or wrapping, or more people using pen and paper, or do we know what that is?
Through the chair, yeah, Councillor Pettingill, we were looking at that, Jeff Wilbert and I, taking a look and wondering about those trends, knowing, like Jeff mentioned, that with COVID, we saw a less usage of reusable bags for grocery shopping, less usage of reusable mugs for coffee, for tea. And so, and some of that plastic and paper is takeaway packaging. So it's, when we looked at the composition of the single-use items, when we look at the composition of the paper and plastics, we think that COVID is an influencing factor, absolutely. And I think we've also heard some of that paper can be compostable, which is promising. And so there's the opportunity through the outreach and education that we have planned to start to steer, of those materials, of the paper that's compostable, steer it to the organic bins, and steer the plastics, shopping bags. There's empty shopping bags found in the samples. Let's make sure that those are being reused or getting to the depots. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My last question, if I understand the numbers right, we're about 191, 192 kilograms per capita off of the provincial target and our waste reduction strategy target. Are we, and there's a lot of good news stories in the data as well, but that one number, do we think, is that correct? And do we think we're on track to correcting that in the next year or 5 years, or where are we on that, do you think?
Through the chair, in terms of if in 2019 we were at the 542 kilograms per capita, and we're targeting to be at 300 next year by the end of 2021, that is an ambitious target. The trend is going in the right direction. I think that it's going to take a few more years to get us to that 300 kilograms per person. And with that being said, we know that the commercial sector is the largest percentage, almost half, 50% of the waste going to landfill. And we know that there's over 30% of that waste is compostable. So we do see that in this next year, and as we continue with education and enforcement of the solid waste bylaw, that we're going to see significant decreases in organics, in commercial sector, in multifamily, similar to what we've seen in the single family residential with that consistent drop over time. So while it is an ambitious target, the 300 kilograms per capita, we're still going in the right direction and we have some big wins to come.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Councillor. Mayor Elliott.
Thank you. So in our feedback to the province, the last bullet says solutions to facilitate recycling without disrupting existing market-based solutions or limiting innovative programs for packaging and paper products from beyond residential sources should be pursued. And that all sounds very good, but I'm wondering if you could point to an example of what you mean by that.
Absolutely. So through the chair, so I'm going to start and give a perspective, and then I am going to turn it over to Jeff to speak to. And so with respect to packaging and paper products, so this is where when we see a lot of plastic in the commercial stream, we recognize that the province has regulated packaging and paper products from residential sources. So that means residents can go to the Queensway Depot, drop off styrofoam, drop off plastic bags, but businesses aren't able to do that because of the way the regulation is set up. So the province is looking at ways to increase the diversion of packaging and paper products from the business sector and seeking feedback from everybody that wants to provide it. And so from a business perspective, the making more materials covered by product stewardship, we don't want that to undermine existing markets that are diverting materials. What I'll do, I'll turn it over to Jeff to expand on that.
Thank you. Through the chair, we do see that there are some effective ICI diversion programs in place. For example, we see cardboard from large retailers like large grocers effectively diverted. We don't see a whole lot of that going into the landfill. So what we were encouraging is, while we encourage the province to continue to look at the EPR programs for the IC&I sector, not to create disruption where programs are effective and where they are working. We also wanted to encourage, any EPRs that the province might bring in, not to stifle options around reduction, reuse, and repair, which current EPR programs can cause some challenges with because they are largely disposal focused. So where there are opportunities for innovation in that sector, we want to ensure it's allowed.
Thank you for that. Our 2021 goal is to get to that 300 kilograms per capita. We've clearly lost some time because of this year, but will we time our audit differently to understand where we are at by the end of 2021?
So through the chair, we don't need the plan is to do the audit on a 2-year cycle. So the next audit is planned for 2022, and in light of to complete an audit is a week-long audit, 30 samples. It's in the order of $21,000. So the intent would be 2022, let's do another audit. As per the official community plan, we will refresh our zero waste strategy that will be informed by the audit. At the end of 2020, however, we will be able to look at what the disposal rate is for 2021, compare it to the target. And the timing will work really well. We'll know where we are with respect to the target. We'll do another round of sampling. We'll update our zero waste strategy to look at, you know, have we met our target? Yes or no? What is our next target and how are we going to get there?
So you don't see an advantage to us adding another audit in 2021, just to, as a marker in our progress?
Yeah, through the chair. In terms of completing another audit in 2021, I think that we're going to have a lot of information just with respect to tonnages, with respect to what's going into the landfill and our diversion rate. Right now we're at 64%. We want to be at 80%. We'll be able to still have those numbers. And so I think that we'll have enough information to be able to continue planning for next steps and to look at, like, I think we know that it's a multi-year process to achieve significant decreases.
A nice musical interlude.
Yeah. Sure is. So we know that it's going to take multiple years to create a significant decrease in that organic. So in short, I would recommend that we stick with the plan on course, which would be to continue to do it every 2 years. However, the option would be available to, we haven't included it in the budget to do a composition audit for 2021. But
well, you have till the 22nd to think about that some more.
Okay.
My last question is that with holding the fees on the small totes for garbage, we definitely got more people's attention when they've realized how big the split has become to the medium tote. And I think a lot of people are wondering, like, how do I exchange the bins? Can it happen on, like, so what is our education to now take advantage of the fact that we sort of caught people's attention? And can we take advantage of that now rather than waiting for the typical cycle?
Yeah, through the chair. Thank you, Mayor Elliott, for bringing that up. We've definitely caught people's attention in financial services. They've reported receiving a number of calls for requests, which is very promising, and caught people's attention so much that we are asking people to, first off, commending them to want to downsize, taking their name and information so that we can continue to plan behind the scenes how we're going to allow for exchanges more than once a year. We know that there's a lead time for totes. Once an order is placed, they're manufactured in Quebec, they're shipped to Squamish, they're outfitted with the bear-resistant features, and then they're made available for delivery. So right now we're working with GFL, we're working with our financial services team to see how we can kind of shorten that time window, if possible, to be able to supply the totes and also to make use of if there's some existing stock that can be used.
I just wondered too if we shouldn't do something a little more proactive to gather more names at this point, because right now we're just waiting for people to call us. But if they knew that we were collecting this data and they had the option, that might be helpful too. So maybe in one of our electronic newsletters that goes out weekly is just acknowledging that pain point and saying, you know, this is our usual cycle, but we are collecting data to see who might be interested, and that might help us out a bit. I never want to miss a good opportunity when we have people's attention. So thanks for the work on this to all of you, and nice to see you again, Wilbert.
Thanks, Mayor Elliott. So I've got Councillor Race up next, and Councillor Pettingill. We've used up the 45 minutes that we had budgeted for this topic, so let's try and be concise and swift, please. Councillor Race.
Thank you. And it's through the staff. you mentioned that, we get this per capita calculation by taking the annual tonnage and dividing it by the population from provincial numbers. In the previous presentation we had, it showed provincial numbers of population going down in the last 2 years, which is kind of counterintuitive and not consistent with the federal numbers. And so it might be, and I know there's no solution to that in this afternoon's discussion, but rather than beat ourselves up too much, that might be one of the reasons that, and it was actually in 2019 and around that time that the province started diverging for some reason from the federal numbers. But my question really, or comment, was really around education and whether we've considered targeting specific breaches, I'll call them, in our policies. In other words, if you see a certain type of thing going into the wrong stream consistently, have we ever considered some kind of targeted education? Because it seems that this education thing is never really done. It seems to require ongoing reinforcement. So whether we might have a program for that or something like that planned for the future.
Thank you. Through the chair, in terms of targeted communications based on kind of what's noted in the waste stream, I think that what's great, yes, education continues, never a dull moment. Jeff started in September, hit the ground running. With respect to, we do have some great channels available so that we can adapt messaging based on trends in the waste stream. And through these lid lifts that GFL is going to be doing. So we have, like, with multifamily, with Jeff going around to properties and connecting with stratas about them having organics bins in place, that soft launch with restaurants, encouraging them to get the bins in place, construction, demolition, education, enforcement. So with those sectors, there's some great work planned for next year. And single family as well. Like I mentioned, there's doing the lid lifts and looking at targeted education. So thank you for bringing that up, because that's critical, that we can be nimble when we see trends and to highlight those so that there's quick feedback and people can adapt their behaviors.
Okay, thank you. And Councillor Pettingill, I'm just going to insert myself before I come back around to you. One of the things that jumped out at me was the word textiles. The report indicates textiles are a depot drop-off item, and that surprised me. What depot can textiles be dropped off at?
So through the chair, or to the chair, so Councillor French, the textiles, when we talk, what falls within textiles most commonly is clothing. And so that would be, and that's an area we can raise awareness in. It would be, so clothing and other textiles like linens, tablecloths, those can go to Pearl's Place, or they can go to, there's a bin at the landfill recycling depot that's serviced by Big Brothers. So that's an area that we can do more education on as well.
Very good. Thanks for the concise answer. And Councillor Pettingill, just before I go to you, Mr. Wickham, you did have your hand up, but you've gone dark, so I've assumed that your point was covered. If that's not the case, let me know. Go ahead, Councillor Pettingill.
Thank you. The mayor reminded me, I understand that our bin size is really a proxy for what our true ongoing cost is, which is the amount of waste. And so I'm wondering, in that respect, while we have people's attention, if they make that commitment to go to a small bin, can we start billing them at that rate and deliver the small bins when we get them, even if it's a year, sort of assume for most of the people they are committed to doing smaller waste, and then we've got them on that commitment, and are we sort of close enough to move forward on that kind of approach and not discourage people from taking on a smaller bin?
Through the chair, thank you, Councillor Pettingill, for raising that point about if people have shown the commitment to going to the smaller bin, while we may not have it in supply, is there the opportunity to give them the lower rate since they've requested it? That's something we need to evaluate with finance when we look at the turnaround times for supply and the impact on budget. That would be the ideal scenario, but still needs to be assessed.
Okay, thank you. Two more things, try and be really quick. On the EPR, my one piece of feedback, even as a consumer, I know you mentioned that we're seeing good success in the residential sector, but as a consumer, I'm seeing still huge amounts of packaging and clamshells and new business models like Amazon evolving to just using a whole lot of packaging. And so for me personally, I would like to encourage the province to start levying fees at the source for plastic packaging, for paper, and really encourage them to develop new business models that ideally don't use it at the first place, but they are a lot more proactive in recovering that and thinking of new business models. So that would be my EPR feedback. And then the final thing that I just want to raise again, I raised a few more times, is I'm still a little bit concerned about the idea of accepting as a base case for the new landfill where we are now. I would like to shoot for a much higher sort of worst case. And so, you know, I'm looking to see in our budgets, whatever it is we need to achieve that. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Fettingale. Council, we have a staff recommendation in front of us. Is there anybody interested in, Councillor Race moves that the Committee of the Whole receive the following information: the 2020 waste composition audit results and feedback submitted to the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change strategy in response to the recycling regulation policy intention paper. Is there a seconder? Councillor Stoner. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Are there any opposed? Motion carries unanimous. Thank you to the trio of presenters.
Thank you very much.
And our next item is short-term rental interim temporary use permit policy. And Planner Asia Phillips, I believe, is leading this discussion. Ms. Phillips, I'll turn it over to you.
Chair. Can you guys all hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Great. I am going to tee up the presentation, and actually Sarah McJanet is with me, and she's going to lead the first half of the presentation. So bear with me while I get things started up here.
We see your screen and the presentation is there.
Thanks. Sarah, are you with us? Are you unmuted?
Ms. McJanet is showing on my screen and currently unmuted. Is your headset turned on, Ms. McJanet? I think there are a number of potential mute points in your system. We're definitely not hearing you. Ms. McJanet, you are unmuted at our end.
Councillor French, I don't have Sarah's portion of the speaking notes, so I can quickly maybe run and print those out, and then I can take over. Either that or I can share my screen and you'll just see the speaking notes.
Chair, the other option is to take a 5-minute recess.
Yeah, let's do that. Well, I'll call a 5-minute recess. We'll come back at 1:45. Thank you. And welcome back to the Committee of the Whole. We believe the technical issues have been sorted out, so I'll ask Ms. Phillip to put the presentation back up on the screen, and Ms. McJanet, take it away.
Great. Thumbs up if you can hear me okay. Perfect. Thank you so much
We
again,
can hear
Sarah
you
McChennick.
okay.
Perfect.
And
Thank you,
Ms.
Chair.
McKenna, your
So,
video is lagging. I think it'd be best if you did turn off your video, please.
perfect. Okay, video is off. Hopefully you can hear me okay now. So without further ado, today Asia and I are presenting draft interim policy and a process to legitimize short-term rentals in some existing suites and coach houses. So those are rentals outside of principal residences in that are set up in our short-term rental regulations in the new zoning bylaw. So our objective today is to get initial feedback from council so that we can refine and bring back this interim policy and process in January 2021 for formal endorsement so that we can implement as quickly as possible. Next slide, please, Asia. So to recap, the expedited temporary use permit option, which involves setting interim policy and a process for a limited number of site-specific temporary use permits. This offered us the most flexibility and the ability to test the waters to legitimize a limited number of short-term rentals and maintain control over the number of approved short-term rentals. This option is precautionary and an expedient approach and was recommended over reopening the zoning regulations again for additional amendments. And it also had less impact on department workloads and our 2021 work plan. So on November 17th, Council asked that we provide a clear path to legalization and that we move quickly to create certainty, that we keep a strong handle on short-term rentals in suites given concern on impacts to neighborhoods, that we consider temporary use permits for less than 3 years in terms of the term, and that we maintain a conservative approach and can consider some caps on a neighborhood basis. And also finally, to focus on short-term rentals where owners live and there's adequate parking on site, and that those units have received building permits and are based on seasoned rentals that are providing high quality accommodation. Next slide, Asia. So before summarizing the interim policy specifics, this is a slide that highlights the legislative authority and the parameters for temporary use permits, focused in on the middle of the slide. So temporary use permits are a distinct tool to enable short-term rental use where otherwise not permitted through our zoning bylaws. So under the Local Government Act, whereas zoning allows us to regulate uses and density of use, we're also able to, as an alternative tool, to issue temporary use permits to allow a temporary use not permitted in our zoning bylaw. And these temporary use permits may be issued with conditions, and we also may require a security. They don't confer rights on a permanent basis. Rather, they allow a temporary use for up to 3 years with 1 renewal possible under the Local Government Act. And we want to clarify that the number of temporary use permits, as well as the term and any conditions, are entirely discretionary. So this is simply to clarify that while we regulate land use through zoning, or alternatively within a temporary use, we do that through those tools and not through business licensing itself. So in order to issue a business license as a precursor, we need to ensure that the use is allowable either through the zoning or through a temporary use permit. Next slide, Asia. So in a nutshell, the interim policy that we're presenting to you today firstly sets an initial temporary use unit cap for suites and accessory dwellings. It also recommends an initial TUP term of less than 3 years. This is in order to proceed cautiously and find a middle ground to allow adequate time for an STR, a short-term rental, to operate, but not so long as a 3-year term in operation is causing negative impacts. Also, to implement Council's directive in a timely way, we are proposing to maintain existing temporary use and business licensing application fees. And then the policy itself aims to set clear basic minimum criteria for temporary use permits, as well as some additional criteria for selecting those short-term rentals that are the best fit based on their individual contexts. So considering locational and qualitative rental aspects. And finally, the policy calls to evaluate temporary use permits before extending additional temporary use permits or extending renewals to maintain that precautionary approach. So I'm going to quickly speak to the first two policy pieces, the cap and the term, and Asia is going to cover the rest. Firstly, determining the temporary use unit cap is a key decision for this interim policy and process. And to inform the decision, we've presented a low, medium, and high number of temporary use permits for issuance. And these are presented relative to the percentage of inventory of secondary rentals that we have being suites or dwelling units. And we've also, on the next slide, which we'll show you momentarily, we've also compared these relative to the total inventory of short-term rentals that are existing in Squamish. So the goal here in this is to support quality visitor rentals and the tourism sector, especially during this pandemic period and our ongoing recovery. We also need to land on a permitting and licensing volume that can be reasonably managed on the processing side within our means and existing resourcing. So taking a precautionary first step, staff recommend a modest medium unit cap of 30 temporary use permits to start in the first 2 quarters of 2021 and then reevaluating. So 30 units represents just under 4% of our known suite and accessory dwelling unit inventory. Next slide, Asia. Thank you. So relative to the short-term rental inventory, a maximum of 30 temporary use permits for suites and accessory dwellings represents about 8% of all active STR rentals that we have listed in Squamish in November. That's 380, according to our host compliance monitoring service. This also, 30 units also represents almost 1/3 of the estimated inventory of suites and coach houses rented through the Airbnb platform at this point in time. So to inform the policy, we also cross-checked the rental frequency of the short-term rental units to look at the number of units that were providing the lion's share of rental nights. However, in the policy, as Asia will note, we haven't prescribed rigid criteria around specific frequency, only that past rental history will be considered to maximize units that are offering regular rentals over occasional rentals. So relative to rental frequency, you can see on this bar chart on the screen that we've broken out the entire unit rental frequency. So within the red box, you can see the number of units that are renting upwards of 60 nights per year. And we've previously noted that these units rented out at this frequency are not being made available for long-term rental. Further, during the short-term rental review process, short-term rental hosts provided insights and noted that owner-occupied high-frequency rentals of greater than 60 nights per year make up a large portion of the nightly rentals, as well as the direct tourism spend and local economic benefit to the community. So the initial recommendation for 30 temporary use permits does not align exactly with the number of units offering the highest frequency rentals, over 120 or 180 nights per year. Initial feedback that we have received from Tourism Squamish, the Chamber, and outreach with some hosts in the community is that this recommendation is too limited. Next slide, please, Asia. The next recommendation is around the temporary use permit term. And so an initial recommendation for 2-year maximum term was determined to allow adequate time to test the use, which would allow for over basically 24 months with 2 full summer and 2 full winter seasons, and also accommodate that advanced booking window for hosts. The 2-year term was felt to be reasonable and not too short as to negate short-term rental hosts' time, effort, and expense to go through the permitting and licensing process. Rather than prescribe automatic renewals in this policy, we are recommending a fulsome reevaluation of the interim policy, along with the overall short-term rental regulatory program before those initially permitted units through the temporary use permits expire. In our outreach and discussion with Tourism Squamish and the
municipal residence or in the secondary suite or accessory dwelling unit. Also, the operator can be the owner or renter of the subject property. 2, that the operator must demonstrate that there has been a prior STR rental history on the property. And 3, that the STR unit must have received an occupancy permit and must meet the safety requirements that are outlined in the short-term rental business license amendment bylaw. So I'll pause here to highlight that during engagement on the policy and the criteria, Tourism Squamish, the Chamber, as well as STR hosts did raise concerns with the second minimum requirement to demonstrate a prior STR rental history on the property. There are concerns voiced that this requirement excludes owners who were complying with the regulations, but that were waiting and wanting to apply to short-term rent. In response to this concern, staff would just emphasize that the intent of the policy is to legitimize STRs that are maximizing the provision of tourist accommodation and associated local economic benefits. New operators are not recommended in this policy in order to preserve the long-term rental opportunity of those suites and accessory dwelling units that have not been converted to short-term rental use. So the shortlisted applications that would meet the first 3 minimum criteria would then be reviewed against these additional evaluation criteria, which include a deeper dive into the short-term rental history, 5, the number of short-term rental business licenses or TUPs that have already been issued in the neighborhood in order to avoid clustering of short-term rentals within the immediate area as well as within the neighborhood. 6, connection to municipal services or approved alternatives. 7, the size and orientation of the dwelling unit and the property, and location of the unit and associated outdoor spaces in relation to neighboring properties in order to avoid potential nuisance, noise, or other negative impacts to the neighboring properties. Consideration would also be given here to avoid aggravating specific known neighborhood issues, such as any chronic parking issues in a specific neighborhood. 8, the impact of the short-term rental vehicle access and parking in relation to roads and neighboring properties. 9, previous history of complaints regarding short-term rentals at the property and responses to TUP application comments received from neighbors. And lastly, 10, geographic proximity to community and tourism amenities, with a preference given to short-term rentals that are within 1,200 meters of these amenities. So TUP applications that best meet these evaluation criteria would then be considered for TUP issuance. The following conditions are proposed to be included for all of the issued TUPs, including 11, paying back building permit fees if the property had received the suite or coach house fee exemption, which occurred between January 2016 and January 2019. 12, limiting STR to 1 dwelling unit per property. 13, refusing or revoking a TUP if property is used for a residential childcare facility. 14, meeting the off-street parking requirement of 1 space per every 2 short-term rental bedrooms. 15, applying for a business license within 4 weeks of the TUP being issued and also meeting the business license bylaw requirements. 16, complying with the district suite and accessory dwelling unit regulations. 17, terminating the TUP if the property is sold or transferred. And lastly, 18, revoking the TUP if any of the above conditions are violated or if the district receives multiple serious complaints about the short-term rental. So now quickly step us through how these TUPs would be processed. Following council endorsement of the policy, a 3-week call window would be open for TUP applications, and applications received in this window would be processed as a single batch. The various processing steps would be completed concurrently for all of the applications in that batch. Additional call windows would be at council's direction or staff's discretion and would be hingent on whether the TUP cap is reached in that initial batch. TUP applications would be initially reviewed against the evaluation criteria minimum requirements. Delegated TUP applications that meet the minimum requirements would then be shortlisted and batched. Applications that don't meet the minimum requirements would be refused. Non-delegated TUPs would be grouped as a separate batch and brought forward for council decision, but this would take longer due to the need to go before council. Continuing, the TUP applications would then be assessed against the additional TUP evaluation criteria. These are the shortlisted applications. If more applications are received than the maximum TUP cap, applications would then be ranked based on their ability to best meet the criteria. There may also be site-specific or case-by-case circumstances that might influence application evaluation above and beyond the evaluation criteria, and staff would exercise discretion in these cases. On the public communication side, the shortlisted TUP applications would follow the district's development and project communications policy protocols, including posting to the development showcase and posting a development sign on the property. Where the district considers issuance of a TUP, notice would be given to neighboring property owners and residents within 100 meters of the site, as well as published in the chief newspaper. The public would then have a 2-week period to submit comments, after which the director would make a decision on issuance. Non-delegated TUPs would go through this same notification process, but would be brought to council subject to agenda availability. Also a note that applicants can apply to have council reconsider a delegated decision of the director. So the proposed potential TUP processing timeline is shown on screen here. Staff estimate that the shortest possible timeframe achievable would be approximately 9 to 10 weeks from the time that the TUP policy is endorsed to when a TUP would be issued. Operators would then have another 4 weeks to submit their business license application, with licenses being issued within a few weeks. And this expedited timeline would then land us with these TUP STRs being legitimized and open for business in time for the summer tourist season. No application fee changes are proposed in association with this interim TUP policy. In addition to the TUP fees shown in this first table, TUP STR operators would be subject to the business licensing fee of $3,000 per year for non-principal residents. The TUP application and licensing cost to legitimize an accessory dwelling for short-term use for the 2-year term is shown in the second table here. For a delegated TUP, the cost would be $4,000 in the first year, $3,000 in the second year. And feedback from Tourism Squamish, the Chamber, and hosts raised concerns that these fees are too high and may be prohibitive or act as a barrier to some operators applying to get licensed and permitted. So this concludes our presentation on the STR TUP policy. Staff look forward to receiving questions and comments from the committee. We're firstly recommending that the committee provide staff with feedback on the policy, and secondly, recommending that council direct staff to finalize the policy, incorporating the feedback we get from you today, and bring it back for endorsement prior to starting proactive enforcement in April.
Thank you for the presentation. Council. Councillor Stoner, followed by Councillor Race, and then Councillor Herford.
Thank you. Through the chair, Ms. Phillips, I want to pick up on the prerequisite that folks have an STR rental history. And I'm just confused why we would positively reward those who have been breaking the law for the last number of years.
Through the chair, yes, I previously spoke to this in the presentation, but if our overall intent is to maximize the units that are essentially doing the short-term rental the best, then we'd be looking for a history that proves that out. Again, that's with the goal of maximizing the local economic benefit with the hosts that are running the best short-term rentals.
So I'll clarify, when I brought this motion forward, that was not my intention. My intention was to be able to provide a pathway to legitimization for those who wanted to. I think it's really important that we provide a level playing field for that, and that we are not exclusively allowing withholding their application or putting their property online because it wasn't actually legally allowed to do so until this time. So that was more of a comment there than a question, but I do have another question in terms of the actual evaluation process and the timing. I'm curious what the staff implications would be if we were to break up the intake process into perhaps 2 different intakes. So those who have been following this topic may be very familiar with the process that is ongoing, but I suspect that there are a number of folks who have not been, and I'm curious if we could break up that intake period, one kind of like that half intake at Q1 and then the other half at Q3 to give the opportunity to those folks who may not have all their ducks in a row to understand the process that's available to them.
Through the chair, I mean, it would certainly have staffing implications to break the process up. There would also be implications to taking the approach to open the policy up to consider anybody, even those who don't have a previous history. I'm not sure exactly of the implications. I'm not sure if Jonas wants to speak to his thoughts on the specifics.
Just to jump in there, I don't mean to open it up. I still am supportive of a cap, but I just think that it should be an even playing field for those who can actually access those licenses.
Yeah, Mr. Valeniscus.
Through you, Chair. So as Asia mentioned, there would be a staffing implication because we were planning to unroll this as proposed. It would be, one call out period. We would have an intensive period of time where we're working on it, processing those applications. And then we would close it probably for another year before we come back, learn from that first intake process, assuming that there will be future intake processes as well. We were just not anticipating one so close in the same year. It's possible, but it would take more staff resources.
That'll do for me for now, Chair. Thanks.
Thanks, Councillor Stoner. Councillor Race?
Thank you. Got me just when I was choking on some water. I was wondering if staff had considered limiting these also by neighborhood or by area, which is my understanding of the route followed by the village of Pemberton. And I say that because one of the concerns for me is neighborhood impact, and too many too close together can just exacerbate that, and whether we've considered somehow spreading them out.
Ms. McJanet.
Thanks. Just let me know if I need to turn off my video as well. But to through the chair,
Please
we
do
did
turn off your video.
Thank you. I was just testing it one more time. Just in case. Thanks so much for the question. And through the chair, we did include criteria, an additional piece around the idea of clustering and trying to avoid clustering. We stopped short of prescribing a specific sort of buffer or a total number, because we wanted to be able to look at sort of the site-specific aspects of the application and trying to land on an arbitrary number out of the gate before we know what the overall distribution of licenses look like under the option C framework is challenging. So we included criteria around avoiding clustering and then stopped there.
Thank you. And second question, Chair, have we ever, and I've mentioned it before, and I've mentioned it at the regional district as well, and I'm just wondering why we would not look at our B&B zoning and maybe think of that as an example, and if, because essentially that's what these are, is more or less the same thing, and it's overnight accommodation, short-term accommodation within residential neighborhoods, and so have we considered just trying to adapt the B&B zoning or point people in that direction?
Ms. Phillips.
So through the chair, we certainly looked at the B&B zoning, and the approach in the option C regulations that were approved in November was to envelop the bed and breakfast as one type of short-term rental, which is the shared accommodation type. And so that is what the option C has been designed for, essentially still allowing traditional bed and breakfasts in every neighborhood with no cap and just needing to go through the business license process.
Okay, I've got comments. I'll save them for later. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Race. Next, Councillor Herford, followed by Councillor Pettingill.
Thank you. Councillor Stoner brought up the point about the STR experience being awaited in the sort of qualifying process, and I agree. I don't think that I'm of the opinion that we shouldn't be penalizing the people that were doing STR previously. I don't want to go that far, but I also don't think that it should be rewarded. I do feel that the fee structure, essentially, I expect that the vast majority that we see apply will be previous STR operators looking to continue what they're doing, but I do think I would like to see opportunity provided for those that weren't participating in the STR, as it wasn't a permitted use previously and now would like to. I'd like them to have a pathway. And to me, when I heard pathway in our original discussion, it wasn't necessarily about the existing STRs having a pathway to legitimacy. It's residents that would like to use their property as an STR having a legitimate pathway to doing so in a controlled fashion. So, and I do believe that the fees sort of lend themselves to existing STR operators applying, but yeah, so I'll leave that there. I guess that's a comment. I'll get to a question. The cap seems to be one of the outstanding questions, and I'd like to understand a little bit more. If we're doing a one intake to hit a 30 cap that's going to run for 2 years, that's sort of how this is presented. But Mr. Vilniskis just said a potential for another window, or maybe there's some attrition if some of the people aren't going to renew for their second year of their business license or something as an extra intake. I just wanted to sort of understand if what's proposed is going to be a 30 intake annually over a prolonged period of time, or if this 2-year study period is really going to be done off one intake of 30. Because then my opinion of where the cap sits changes, whether that's an annual number that gets sort of starts rolling over once these TUPs expire, or if this is a one shot to get us there. Thoughts, please?
I can take a first approach at it, and then maybe Sarah can jump in as well. I think the intent was to keep it flexible because we really don't know how many people are going to apply for these temporary use permits, and how many will be issued, and then be able to follow through with the business licensing. And so I think the real intent here is to keep it flexible, and that staff would be looking for further council direction following that initial intake based on what we see pan out on the ground.
Okay, thank you. I see your hand there, Elliot.
So I have one more, if that's okay.
Go ahead, Councillor Herford.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that reply, Asia. I'm curious, the original, on the existing STRs, I like pulling data from them because they have been successful in their endeavors. Have we overlaid these regulations just in a sort of a desktop exercise to see how many would fit the criteria? Like, of those existing ones, are there a portion of them that were, for whatever reason, are going to fall outside this the more stringent criteria that we have?
Through the
Asia and I can take a stab at that if you like.
Sure.
Sarah here. Thanks. Sorry, it's like there's no it's just a floating voice. Thanks so much through the chair. The in terms of those minimum criteria, and the key one being that the owner lives on site, we do know from our engagement with during the public hearing process that a number of a large majority of the units that are operating within secondary suites and coach houses are owner occupied. So we know that there's a very high number within those unit types that where the owner lives within the principal dwelling on the property. So we know that there's quite a few that will be meeting that criteria. The other minimum criteria around occupancy permit, we haven't done that overlay yet to sort of cross check and see whether those are all legal suites versus suites that have been put in and don't have occupancy permits. So we haven't done that overlay, but hopefully that speaks to some of those minimum criteria and what we know.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Herford. Councillor Pettingill.
Yeah, thank you. A couple questions, then I guess lots of comments, which I'll save for later. The first one, I'm wondering why we decided to stick with defining a full-time resident as 5 months a year. And from all the discussion we've had, it seems that we would have a higher standard, at least to me. I didn't hear from anyone, including myself, a desire for someone to be able to rent out their vacation home, and as that is a problem we're trying to solve. But it seems to me that's what we sort of get towards when the cutoff is 5 months. So is there a reason why we couldn't make that 9 months or 10 or 11 months as the minimum definition for a full-time resident?
Through the chair, there's no reason why we couldn't consider that. So I encourage council to give us that feedback during the comment period. We kept it in line with how we had defined principal residence in the original short-term rental amendment bylaws, just to maintain that consistency as well. I mean, that original intent was that there are those types of snowbirds and people who legitimately live in their principal residence, but they are gone for half the year to another location. And so it was kind of in line with that ability for those types of people to be able to fall in line with the regulations.
Okay, thanks. The other one that I'm struggling with is one of the conditions is geographic proximity of proposed STR to key community and tourism amenities, preference for STRs within 1,200 meters of established commercial, civic, educational, health services, trail hubs, and community amenities. And I think the sort of overarching thing we're trying to deal with is the balance between what makes sense for long-term rental stock versus short-term rental stock. And some of those criteria, like proximity to civic services, education services and even health services, I would say if you're high in those categories, that says this should be an LTR more than an STR to me. And so I'm wondering how we're thinking about these, and somewhat related to it, and just wondering how it all fits together. You know, I believe there's a property at Darrell Bay, and I don't know where they fall in terms of reviews and so on. They'd hit high on proximity to tourism assets, I think, but to my mind, not some of the other ones. But yet, to me, that is, in terms of geographic location and a lot of the other criteria, would really make sense to enable that as an STR. But it seems from this criteria, there'd be a fairly high risk of excluding that as an STR, and it doesn't seem like that would be the most appropriate, in my mind, location for an LTR with affordability in mind, because there's no transit, there's no walkable services, and all these sorts of things. And so I'm just wondering how we came to these conclusions and why things like civic services and educational services for tourism focused accommodation is in the criteria.
Through the chair, I'll take an initial stab at addressing that. So some of the thinking around the geographic proximity was more from a perspective encouraging active transportation and minimizing the need for these tourists to drive to access kind of some of the amenities that they might be visiting Squamish for. So that was, I think, a main driver in kind of including that locational approach. But I certainly hear your point about sort of competing with whether that's better to be for long-term rental. Sarah, is there anything else to add?
Thanks, Asia. I think you hit the nail on the head. I think it was sort of a combination of looking to support short-term rentals in those key areas where visitors are wanting to be, to basically cut down on the transportation and travel and the parking and the sort of those aggravations that can also cause issues in neighborhoods. But then also, you know, in our discussions with the Chamber and Tourism Squamish and hosts, I think we recognize bigger picture that there's really a variety of accommodations and location that visitors are looking for, and that some of these unique spots and places might not be, you know, they might be further afield, like up in Paradise Valley or the Darrell Bay example that you provided. Certainly those are areas that are not accessed by, you know, by transportation, but also offer different kinds of experience and proximity to tourism amenities. So I think it's really going to be a combination of looking at the different assets and attributes of these different short-term rentals and what they offer. And, you know, all else being equal, I think we might, you know, try to look for short-term rentals that are filling, you know, in close proximity to these key areas, but recognizing that there's going to be diversity and that we want to be able to help support a diversity of accommodation.
Okay, if I could just follow up, and Asia reminded me of the other piece that didn't quite make sense to me, and I'm wondering if you can help me understand. There are some requirements I would consider significant around parking, which seems to suggest we are pushing people towards car-based tourism, or people that are at least coming here in cars or requiring a car, as opposed to building a tourism model that doesn't require a car. And then at the same time, we're saying, and then we want them to use public transit. And I guess to me, this is another piece where I'm like, doesn't then, if, you know, this is a place that's on a transit area where there's good transit and that's the preference we're giving it, doesn't that make more sense for a long-term rental? Because I think realistically, we may be a little more car dependent in terms of tourism for the next while. And so if there's parking requirements, then maybe the transit piece isn't as important for tourists, and it is more important around long-term rentals. And when we're thinking about where these properties belong, I'm wondering if, you know, when you're on a transit line, there's easy transit, if that makes more sense as a long-term rental as opposed to an STR.
Through the chair, I think maybe that's more of a comment and a feedback for us to receive. Certainly, there's a distinction between somebody visiting and needing to drive here because we don't have regional public transit in place, and the challenges around kind of just getting to Squamish, and a distinction between then once you're in Squamish, the utilization of public transit and our active transportation facilities to access some of the amenities. I don't really have anything further to add to that.
Mr. Valeniskas, go ahead.
Thank you. Through the chair, I think the reality is that both of these uses, the long-term rental and the short-term rental, in an ideal scenario, compete for the same locations, well-connected locations. So it is, there's arguments both ways.
Anything further, Councilor Pettingill?
Not for now. Thank you.
Okay. Staff, I sense that you've been taking notes of comments so far. Thank you for doing that. Mayor Elliott, and then I'll follow Councilor Rice.
Thank you. Has any thought been given to, as we do with an RFP, ranking these criteria or weighting them? And I ask that because I imagine some people's applications won't be approved, and there is the ability to come to council, and there just doesn't seem to be a lot of transparency about which item takes precedence over the other, or what information you would give to council aside from a subjective interpretation of these guidelines, if someone came to dispute the decision. So have we thought about weighting them in any way?
Ms. Phillip?
Through the chair, I think we were wanting to bring this initial policy and get council's feedback before we pursued that ranking or weighting. And I think when we have that discussion, we should think about what the intent of the policy is and really try to design the criteria and the ranking to meet that intent.
Thank you. Just following up on Councillor Pettengill's question around the 5-month criteria as it defines a primary residence. Does our business license bylaw include the requirement to have someone that is reachable at all times?
Yes, that's the way that the business license is written, is that there needs to be a contact who's available at all times and can get to the property, I believe, within 3 hours notice.
Right. Okay, good. So that sort of covers those times where the principal property owner might not be on site. Thank you for that. I think that is all my, my last question. It talks about that last TUP condition where it talks about revoking the permit in the case of multiple or egregious complaints. And I wonder if we should not define that a little bit. So I might get a TUP and end up with a neighbor who doesn't like that I do STR rentals, and they might complain every week. But the complaints aren't egregious. It's just that this person has a bone to pick and they don't want an STR next to them. So every week it could be another little thing. Versus someone who, noise violations and the police are showing up and it's a party house and all that sort of stuff. So I think it would be helpful to maybe define that, because I'm a little bit more. So I think it's quite loose.
Thanks, Mary. I'll let Councillor Rice.
Well, I wondered, just based on your last comment, Chair, is this the time when you want comments or are looking for comments?
Yeah, I think we are at that point. So actually, Mayor, or Councilor Rice, just hold for half a second. What I would like to do at this point is go to staff and based on comments that you've heard so far, could you feed back what you've captured to this point? Is that a reasonable request?
Might be a bit of a challenging request. I can certainly take a stab at it, and then maybe Sarah and Jonas can flush out.
Just a point of
Hold
order.
on, Ms. Field. Mayor Elliott?
Yeah, just on a point of order. I thought we were in questions and then we would do comments.
Okay,
And
very
so I didn't think staff actually had captured our comments, although people have been providing some editorial throughout.
Yeah, certainly. And I think this would be easier for staff if we just held off on that, Ms. Phillip, and allow council to go ahead with comments. And Councillor Race, you're first up. And Mayor Elliott, do I have you following with comments? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So my first comment is, notwithstanding that I voted for this process to go through to come to this point, my first choice is probably to leave the existing bylaw alone. But I did want to give this proposal a fair hearing, so here we are. But if it does go ahead, I do have a few comments. The fees that were proposed, I think, are fine, notwithstanding that they're a little bit more than normal, because I think we have to keep in mind that these operations typically, as far as I understand, are not paying taxes, property taxes on a commercial basis, but rather on a residential basis, which is, of course, a fraction of that. What we might consider doing, if we haven't already captured it, is adding extra utility fees to recognize increased traffic and increased use for these businesses. The full-time residential, I agree with Councillor Pettengill's comments. It should be longer, I think, than 5 months. And I'm thinking in the range of 7 to 9 months. I know I've talked to a couple of people in the community that do rent out their entire house. And they do it when they go for an extended holiday. It's not something they usually do on a weekend or anything. So they're off somewhere for 1 or 2 or 3 months for the winter or for the summer or whatever. The parking of 1 per room, to me, might be a little bit light. I think we want to take steps to try to ensure that there's no additional on-street parking, which I think is already a problem in some neighborhoods. And we might consider it as 1 per room, because, or not 1 per 2 rooms, but 1 per room, because if you had 2 couples show up in separate cars, then you've got one in the street, so in different rooms. So my big concern, I think, with this is with respect to the TUPs, and my experience with them comes largely from experiences we've had at the regional district, where there's been a number of TUP issues pop up over the years with not with Airbnbs, but actually with outfitter licenses and guiding and all that kind of stuff on some provincial tenures. And I think the question we have to ask ourselves, even though we're at the start, is what happens in 3 or 5 or 6 years, whenever the second renewal might expire. And what was happening at the regional district is people were slightly altering their operation and calling it a new application, and coming back and trying to continue on in the TUP process. And so to stop that, I think what we want to consider is at the end of the second renewal, if we're going to continue with the TUP process, at the end of the second renewal, there is no further TUP application period for X number of years. So they can't just adjust it and apply for another TUP and call it a new application. And I think, and the reason I say that or suggest that is because we came to the same position in the Regional District Board. What we want to do is urge people who get these TUPs to contemplate a rezoning and make it a more permanent operation. So clearly within the first term, there's a little bit of trial and error and should they do it. But if they're going to go for a second renewal, they should be thinking they're a little bit more committed to the project and they should be thinking about rezoning. And I think we should consider the same thing here. because otherwise we're just going to have a hassle in a few years. But we might consider the same thing here. And that's why I keep going back to the bed and breakfast thing, is making sure that the zoning of the bed and breakfast aligns with the Airbnbs and vice versa. So that would be, if people really do want to be in this business permanently or long term, then they should be thinking zoning. TUPs, from my mind, are for relatively short duration things, one-offs and so forth, not for an ongoing business enterprise or an ongoing business model. That's where we need zoning, and then it can be properly taxed and dealt with like a zoning application. So I would try to kind of urge people, if they are going to commit to this and they're going to go for a renewal after the first 1 or 2 or 3 years, that they start thinking about zoning and we start pointing them in that direction. And those are my comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Mayor Elliott.
Thank you. My comments are made in the context of the bylaw we approved, which is to allow STRs in a primary residence, which makes many thousands of homes available for this use. I would say, I'll just follow up my comment, the geographic criteria that are in there, I'm not so married to, that being in proximity to certain things. But I am very supportive of spreading this across different neighborhoods. And I think there should be more rural choices as well, not just the more urban hosts. I think there is some room there to increase the number. I think 30 is a bit low. I think 40 or 45 would be more reasonable. I think we should strengthen the complaints language in the TUP conditions so that it's quite clear what's going to get you offside and what's going to be more a focus of education or altering your hosting habits. I'm absolutely supportive of actually focusing this on the hosts that are doing high yield nights of rentals. This, in my mind, was to support our tourism industry. And so I think it's important that the folks that get to do this see themselves more as part of that industry. And this is in response to that. I don't think that we should let more users get used to having their secondary suites as short-term rentals. The criteria around having an occupancy permit is really smart. Thank you for that. I think there should be one intake. I think staff have designed some thoughtful criteria here. And to me, this was to loosen the restrictions a little bit and not open the door too wide. So I'm happy where this sits, but I wouldn't mind seeing the number go up. I think there will be demand for tourism later in 2021. And I think that we should have a few more options in the STR realm. Those are my comments. Thanks for your work on this.
Thank you. I have Councillor Stoner, followed by Councillor Pettingill, then Councillor Anderson, and Councillor Herford.
Thank you. Thanks to staff for your work on this and bringing the draft TUP process forward. I do think it gets us in the right direction to provide an option for legitimization. I do think the fee structure is very on point. I think it helps, although it may seem a little bit high to some, I do think it is fair relative to other commercial operators, as we are not collecting commercial tax. They're being taxed at a residential unit level. And I do think it means that those who are serious will apply, not those who just want to do this off the side of their desks. I do think that the unit cap at 30 seems a little bit low. I'd be willing to go a little bit higher, around 40 as well. And I, as previously mentioned, would like to see a staggered intake. So whether that is 20 at the first set, and then even if it's just 20 the following year, understanding that every 6 months might be too substantive on a staff capacity perspective. But I think that provides a fair playing field. And with respect to the evaluation criteria, I would like to see number 2, the requirement for previous STR owner occupation rental history removed. Although I appreciate they may be the ones that can demonstrate that they have previously built this industry, I don't think that that should exclude others from trying to participate. So I think that if that's the concern, we add some language in the business licensing around ensuring that a certain number of nights have been rented the previous year before you get your next year's business license renewal. But I don't think it means that we should preferentially allow those who have been doing this to get first access. I don't think that that is fair. Yeah, and I think that that is it for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Stoner. Councillor Pettingill.
Yeah, thank you. A few things. I have started to see STRs as a home-based business. And from my perspective, it is important that people are here much more than 5 months of the year. I think to receive the benefits of a home-based business, it does mean that you are there working your business, being able to walk to work because it's at your home and those sorts of things. And that's just, if it's a vacation property, if you're only there a few months, it doesn't have those benefits to my mind. I do think, you know, we should adjust our criteria a little bit, in particular proximity to civic and education facilities, and even health facilities, especially if it's like a dentist office and that sort of thing. To me, that really says this pushes me into thinking this is better suited as an LTR, and there might be better options for the STRs at this spot. I think, you know, I do share some of the apprehension about only making this available to existing STR hosts, but with the fee structure and the TUP, I mean, it's 2 years is proposed, and that doesn't mean you can then apply for a 4-year. It's 3 years and you're done. So we're cutting off a year of the theoretical max. And so to my mind, anyone that would go in that from ground zero with no capital investment on the facility, you haven't built up the customer base, that really calls into question, in my mind, some of the business decisions you might be making. I think it's a very high barrier to entry for people who've already made that capital investment and so on to continue on. I think maybe you could justify these costs and taking the risk on the limited TUP. But you know, from my perspective, we'd really need to go and do something different than a TUP and really look at those rates if we wanted to make this equitable across people who didn't already have operating LTRs. And so that's just a question of, do we want to facilitate and enable people who I think would be quite likely to fail? And I'm not sure that that's our goal here. I guess a couple of other things, you know, I just wanted to comment, I appreciate that we have enabled LTRs within a residence. I do have some concerns about the equity in that there is some level of safety and privacy in not having someone in your actual house. And so who feels comfortable in doing that? I think that is something to be considered, and one of the reasons why I would like to enable STRs and suites. The other piece that is COVID, and this speaks to the 2-year TUP and some of the fees relative to revenues, because we've seen costs increase to keep things clean in COVID. We're sort of hopeful COVID will change, but we don't know what the economic fallout will be. It may last for another tourism season. And so we may be looking at it effectively a 1-year operational TUP if people apply now, just because of the realities of COVID. And, you know, I'm guessing that in the past, if it was a bigger suite, you might have had 2 families vacationing together. And so the spend per night in a suite, I would anticipate, might be down somewhat in terms of COVID. And so thinking about how many units, if our goal is to maintain that tourism revenue, I think 30 might be too low of a number. And the other reason I'm concerned about 30 is even if someone is really adamant they're going to do this, and they succeed in the process, some of those people, for whatever reason, will have a family change, a job change, and they will fall out. And maybe there'll be another intake, but I don't think we'll hit 30 operating ones. And so to my mind, if our tolerance is 30 operating ones and we think that's what the tourism sector needs, we should target 40 or 45 with the expectation that we'll have 30 or so ongoing active ones. So I would prefer a higher number enabled. And I think those are my comments for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor. Next, Councillor Anderson, followed by Councillor Herford.
Thank you. Overall, I'm pleased to see that we're continuing with the principles of a precautionary approach and also a nimble approach. These continue to be emphasized. With respect to the 30-unit cap, I'm satisfied that ongoing and fairly short-term evaluation is proposed. And so this alleviates that concern for me. With respect to impact on neighborhoods, I do appreciate that further defining of criteria to avoid too dense a clustering and other potential neighborhood impacts could be premature. Then we need to gain some experience, and I accept staff's account of this circumstance. Following the Tourism Squamish, and it's their first point in their letter under qualifying criteria, and I acknowledge some of my colleagues share the same concern. That is that considering properties who have prior STR rental history, I think that this may be too exclusive, and for the reasons that have already been highlighted by my colleagues. Finally, I'm concerned. I wish to highlight the concern that Planning Department draws attention to, and that is that there may be some delay for some other Planning Department policy work. And I'd like to highlight this, and I'm quite concerned about it. My initial sympathy was to proceed and with the bylaw that we had. I'm happy with where we're at. But as far as fine-tuning and fussing, I think we need to be mindful of other priorities for staff and for council. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Anderson. Councillor Herford.
Thank you. A few things. I would like to see, I mentioned earlier my preference for having a more open process than just limiting this process to the existing short-term rentals providers. I do think that having some clarity and making our decisions or the delegated decisions very defendable, so having a weighted process, I believe it was Mary Elliott that brought that up, makes a lot of sense to me. So in that context, I could see a minimal amount of points being given to potentially given to an existing STR operator, but that's as far as I would be willing to go on that particular point. I do think if we were to do annual intakes to reach a certain number, then I would be looking to start at a lower number to build up the inventory of STRs over time, and potentially as aligned with our recovery from COVID and learning from seeing that there's going to be some attrition through sale of property or whatever reason in the STR operators. So sort of finding that target over time is something that I'm curious about. If in fact this is going to be one intake and we'll study it for 2 years, and we're going to look at the STR regulation as a whole, then I'm comfortable with the 30 number. So to me, that hasn't been quite clear in this presentation so far, and I know that we're all still working our way through it, so I appreciate that. I agree the proximity to service, although the 1 point, it seems that almost everything in Squamish is 1.2K from I think the valley's not much further across in a lot of areas. So, but I do think that the proximity to service, as Mr. Vilniskis, I think the reason we're all here actually having this discussion is that these are competing uses between STR and LTR. So I don't know if that the waiting for the proximity is actually appropriate for the short-term rental. What else do I have? I think that's going to be it for now, but I'm not supportive of a number larger than 30 on this one-time intake. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor. And recognizing that we're way over time, my one comment that I feel strongly about is one intake. I don't support staggered intake. And with that, Ms. Phillip, are you now prepared to give us a quick summary of the feedback you've heard?
Sorry, I was muted. Through the chair, I think what staff would desire is to have some stronger council direction where there was diverging thoughts on some of the criteria in order for us to land on something that we can bring back for endorsement. So I don't know if that means voting or just coming to more of a consensus. Particularly on the criteria for properties to demonstrate the previous rental history. It seems like there was divergence on that, divergence on the number of intakes, and divergence on the cap number.
Okay. Options. Mr. Vilniskis.
Just following on what Asia mentioned, those 3 areas where we have some competing comments. Maybe we could just do a show of hands on each one of those to see how much support there is, and then whatever makes it through, we can include in the final motion.
Okay, so let me start with the cap number, which staff has recommended at 30. Can I see a show of hands? Who supports that number 30? Okay, so that's five hands.
Well, can I just ask?
Yes.
Isn't the question who wants to make it higher? I mean, I support the number 30, and I also want it higher.
Okay, then let's pose the question. Who would like to see the number increased above 30? Hands. So we have 3 hands.
Thank you.
So that 30 was the intake number, correct? Okay. The cap.
Sorry to clarify, 30 was the cap, the maximum number of TUPs that would be issued. There's
Okay,
no cap on how many applications we would accept.
Okay, excellent. So the number of applications we would accept, was there a number in the report for that? I don't recall.
Staff have no idea how many people will apply for this TUP process.
Councillor Pettingill suggested between 40 and 45. Am I correct? Councillor Pettingill? So could we poll how many councillors support 45 applications as an intake? Yes.
To clarify through the chair, we would we have no cap on intake. We will accept all applications that come in for the TUP. It's then what we review against the criteria and how many are shortlisted. But what we want it to land on is the number of TUPs that would be issued.
Not really following how that compares to the cap number. Mayor Elliott.
Councillor French, we can't limit the number of people that apply. Anybody can apply. What staff is saying is that they'll then rate those against the criteria outlined in the policy, and they will not approve more than 30 based on the show of hands that we just saw. So we can move on to the next issue they want clarity on. Which is the previous history. How do we pull that?
Through the chair, my suggestion would be just a show of hands who supports keeping the evaluation criteria that TUPs would be considered only for properties that have a prior STR rental history, and who is in support of that, keeping that criteria in the policy.
Okay, council, I see 2 hands. Are there any others? Very good. Does that give you what you need?
Yes.
And does that mean we can then move to the staff recommendation? Ms. Phillip?
I think the last thing staff are seeking clarification on is any council preference for a staggered intake or more than one initial intake. And I would just stress that staff can also keep this flexible. If we see more than the 30 TUP maximum, like more than 30 applications received, then we can come back and have a further discussion. We also don't know how many short-term rental business licenses under the option C principal resident requirement will be issued. And so we'll have a much better picture later on in 2021, and we can come back to council with that picture.
So poll question would be, how many councillors support one intake? Okay, very good. And now are we at the point where we can explore the staff recommendation? Ms. Phillip?
Great, so
Council.
through the chair, would you like me to summarize the feedback or?
Yes, please.
Okay, so to start off with, alignment with maintaining the 30 maximum issuance cap, removal of criteria number 2 to only consider those with a previous STR rental history, consensus to do 1 intake, and then perhaps come back to council if we receive more than 30 applications. There was some consensus that the geographic locational criteria was not necessarily critical to evaluation and was competing with long-term rental supply. And then additional notes I have are to strengthen the TUP condition language, particularly around the complaints received for a property and general consensus that the fee rate is acceptable as is currently proposed. And I think that's all of the notes that I have. Sarah, Jonas, do you have anything to add to that?
Sarah here. The other one is around the full-time residential sort of tenancy requirement. So I heard from several that to increase beyond the 5 months per year to, I heard Councillor Race mention 7 to 9 months. And I'm not sure if anyone actually, Councillor Pettingale, did you also make mention of that as well?
I think I mentioned 9, 10, or 11. I mean, for me, it's as high as
Yeah.
possible.
Councillor Hervard?
Sorry, I just quickly looked at my notes and I had over 6 months in my notes. I may not have said that out loud in the comments. I don't know if we need to do another poll here, but to me, primary means more than half the time.
Councillor Pennington?
Yeah, I just want to, my colleagues, for me, in terms of the criteria, I think having some of those criteria in terms of proximity to services, some of the specific ones make sense and other ones really don't. And so for me, I wasn't looking for an absolute sort of throw them all away. But, the closer you are to tourist amenities, the more it makes sense. But civic and educational is the opposite of what we want, I think, in terms of prioritizing for STR. And so I don't know how deep we want to go into drilling down on what does or doesn't make sense in terms of criteria. I think some make sense, but just not those specific ones, maybe.
Okay, thank you. Councillor, are there any other points? Staff, that sums it.
Through the chair, I have one last request. If there could be any further clarification on ranking or awaiting, are there any particular criteria that council would want to see weighted heavier than others? That would be great to get that feedback.
Council. Councillor Storm?
I might throw this for a loop here. I think my preference would actually be to move as much as we can towards a clear meet, don't meet criteria, as opposed to weighting some over the others and then putting that burden on staff for ranking them and making that decision. I think if we're able to make our criteria clear and the application meets it or does not, then if we have more than the 30 cap, we put them in a bucket and we randomly select those who can actually get the TUP. But I think the more we can remove the subjectivity from staff's perspective would be my preference.
Mayor Elliott.
I'm happy for staff to take this away and think about that. So think about if you get 80 applications, how you're going to narrow it down to 30. And as Councillor Stoner said, the most helpful way to do that. And maybe that is, it either meets it or doesn't meet it. Or you may feel some of them, it's better to help you rank them. And I also think about when this comes before council and someone's disputing it, what will they say to council? And what will staff say to council? And without some sort of idea of how these were adjudicated, I think it's hard for council to be put in that position. So I'm happy to leave that piece of it up to staff. It's not about creating work, it's about creating a process that is as transparent as possible and is defendable. So I don't think we need to decide here.
Councillor Herford, followed by Councillor Pennington.
Thank you. I was thinking about this this criteria, and I agree with the mayor. We want to make sure that we have when people dispute it, that we really understand what was happening. And one of the points was that avoiding clustering, and I'm really curious how that clustering, of course, means that someone was there first, and then now we're going to look at another application. So if it was a rolling applications over years, and you could see there's an established one or two, and that could be a cluster, and that piece. I wasn't sure how to weight when I was contemplating weighting it. So I want to make sure we capture that particular piece, especially when we're doing a one-shot intake. So it does create sort of a first past the post. I don't know, that piece I'm not quite sure how to put, but I'm happy to leave it to staff to contemplate that. But I want to make sure that we're very clear.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Pennington.
Yeah, I just want to clarify as we send staff away that, I think staff said that a key objective with what has been brought to us is to keep as much of the existing tourism revenue associated with STRs as we can. And so I just want to that is still, in my mind, one of the key objectives with what we are trying to do here. And I wonder if that would be helpful to staff if we can agree that that is still an objective for the majority of us as an outcome, that we are maintaining as much of a tourism spend as we can with whatever they come back with.
Thank you. Mayor Elliott.
I would like my colleagues to reconsider eliminating the criteria that people have had experience. So we're going to be granting someone a 2-year license to operate a short-term rental. And what if they're really bad at it? What if they're the ones that are generating lots of complaints? So at least when we know someone's got experience, they've already been interested in it, their suite has not been used for this use so far, and we have a history that we can rely on, that they were either a good operator or they weren't, because we've seen lots of complaints from their adjacent neighbors. So I would at least like to leave that in until we see the criteria for ranking or weighting or yes knowing, versus eliminating it right out of committee of the whole. I think it's possible to strike it out later in the process, but it's if our goal is to support the tourism spend, then we should be looking at people that know how to do this. And everyone else has the opportunity to turn their primary residence into an STR when they need it. So I would just hope that council can rethink that one and at least take it to the next step in terms of how it would show up in a ranked system or some other way, and then decide.
Councillor Stoner.
So I think what we had come to consensus on was removing evaluation criteria 2 under the minimum requirements. Criteria 4 is still there under additional evaluation criteria, which takes into account previous history. My inclination is actually to move to actually taking that one out as well, but I'm happy to leave it in as the evaluation criteria is firmed up. I feel quite strongly that although it's helpful to have a history from folks who have previously been doing this, I don't think it's fair to exclusively allow it access to those who have been breaking the law to date. And there are those, I know there are many who have been sitting on the sidelines waiting to engage in this process and doing the right thing and not listing their homes on STR. And I think giving them due process to engage is really important. Both in the TUP process, there's language around complaints and being able to revoke a TUP. There's also that language in the business license, and the business license gets renewed every year. So I do think that there are safety nets in place where those things can be checked. But I think in order to enable due process for all potential operators, it's important to open up those minimum criteria at the very least.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Hill.
Yeah, just from a staff perspective on that criteria number 2, 2 other things to consider is that if we do remove that criteria, we may see a much larger number of applications. We don't know how many applications we're going to get, but if the criteria is less restrictive off the hop, then we may certainly see more applications. So that just adds a bit more to staff workload. And then the second item is that really one of staff's intentions was to not see additional conversion of suites and coach houses from long-term rental, or at least from the opportunity to do long-term rental to short-term rental. And perhaps if we remove that criteria, it may also encourage people that were doing long-term rental to convert to short-term rental.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Herford, Councillor Race, Councillor Anderson, on that previous history issue, where are you at? Do you maintain your original stance on that, Councillor Herford?
I do, in so much as the I don't think it should be exclusively for. If we have some criteria where it's one of the factors and it can be lightly weighed, I think that's fine. I think our feedback from our tourism industry would like to see a larger number. I think we're guaranteeing, this regulation is nearly guaranteeing the success. I do on one hand, and I do think the fees are prohibiting someone else trying to get into it on the other hand. So I think we're in a good spot, but just on principle, people that have been operating in contradiction to our regulations, I don't want to be rewarding for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Anderson?
Personally, we have a rather, maybe use the word elaborate, but it's a onerous procedure and set of criteria and diverse criteria already here. So I'm not nervous about this issue as regards the quality of the applicants. And the other thing is that there's not many that are going to be considered. We have a rather tight boundaries as to how many, and I think that so I'm not sure I'm concerned about the quality of the offering being affected, and otherwise am also considering the issue of principle. Thank you. So I'll stay with my earlier position.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Rice.
Yeah, I'm open to further discussion, particularly along the lines of the weighting. That might be one of those things that could figure into a weighting formula. So I'm happy to reverse my previous decision and go for the further discussion.
Thank you. Ms. Phillip, does that give you everything you need? Very good. And is there a council member prepared to move the staff recommendation? Councillor Rice, moved by, seconded by Councillor Stoner. Is there any further discussion? Councillor Stoner.
I do just want to say a big thanks to staff for turning this around so quickly. It is a tight timeline and it's a thorny issue and there's lots of pieces to consider. So I appreciate the thought and due diligence that went into the staff report and the conversation that we've had here with council today.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Seeing none, motion carries. Unanimous. Thank you. Now, Mayor Elliott, we have on our agenda to close. There is only basically 45 minutes between now and the public hearing at 6. So I am turning to Ms. Arthur for some guidance. And Ms. Arthur is recommending that we recess to reconvene following the special meeting. Which means, so we simply recess this meeting and then reconvene at 6 o'clock.
Or you can just do nothing, terminate the meeting until closing, and add a motion to be special, but it's not usually good to do that when it's only a public
Okay.
hearing.
Mayor Elliott.
I'd prefer to leave this meeting open and just recess, and we'll reconvene after the special meeting this evening.
Very good. That is what we will do, which means that we will reconvene at 6 p.m.